Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome back to our close readings of Slow Down by Kōhei Saitō. Today we continue the fourth chapter, Marx in the Anthropocene. Last week we talked about the commons and how it is important to put the commons at the basis of Marx's thought, and from there we will build an ecological critique of climate change. But like we said from the beginning of this close readings, of this series of close readings, Marx has often been criticized as incompatible with ecology for his productivism and also for his Eurocentrism. Now, what is that? Well, often when people say that Marx and ecology are like oil and water, it's because they reduce Marx's thought to just the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848 with Engels, back when he was 29 years old. Marx was just 29 when he co-wrote the manifesto, and we mention his age because it's a mistake to take a thinker in his youth as representative of his whole thought. If at 29 the criticism of being a productivist and a Eurocentrist holds, when we see the evolution of his thought when he matured, well, the criticism doesn't hold anymore. At the end of his life, Marx was neither a productivist nor a Eurocentrist, and instead he is deeply ecological. So what does the Communist Manifesto say? Well, Saito provides a summary of it, quote, "The advance of capitalism involves the extreme exploitation of workers by capitalists, widening the gap between the rich and poor. Capitalists compete against each other, raising their productivity, which leads to the production of more and more commodities. But workers, exploited due to low wages, cannot afford to buy those commodities. This eventually leads to a crisis of overproduction. The already exploited workers thus suffer another blow, this time due to the unemployment stemming from this crisis, and rise up en masse, bringing about a socialist revolution. The capitalists are purged, the workers freed." So this is what Marx is often reduced to as someone who believes that socialism is only attainable by rises in productivity, and that productivity can only rise in capitalism, making them not only rise in productivity levels necessary, but also it makes capitalism itself necessary. However, since capitalism relies on the exploitation of workers and preventing them from accessing the goods produced under capitalism, so this is overproduction. You produce more goods than you can let people have access to those goods, and you get overpopulation because in order for the capitalists to make profits, they need to lower costs as much as they can. So to lower costs means that you have to pay your workers less. But that means that the workers cannot buy what was produced. And so you end up with piles of commodities that's just sit there in warehouses, and that pile is overproduction. When that happens, you have an economic crisis. People don't buy your stuff because they are too poor, and so you don't make profits, and so we are in a recess. So in response to this overproduction and the economic crisis that comes with, the workers will eventually rise to overthrow the capitalist system by a revolution and redistribute not just those goods, but also the means of production themselves, so that no one has a denied access to production, and now we would have communism. So you have capitalism, which raises productivity levels, but it creates a crisis of overproduction, which leads to economic crisis, which sparks socialist revolutions. You can reduce this to the formula: productivity must rise under capitalism to bring about socialism. And so this is productivism. The development of productive forces, technology, industry, science, etc. is inherently progressive, and that socialism or communism requires high levels of productive development inherited from capitalism. So while it is true that Marx was a productivist in his early days, he revised some of his assumptions about capitalism's collapse towards the time of Das Kapital, and then completely abandoned productivism altogether after that. First, Marx believed that the socialist revolution is imminent, that already in 1848 the collapse of capitalism is right around the corner. For Marx, capitalism is bound to enter a period of crisis during which the proletariat will rise and take over. And in 1848, the same year he published the Manifesto, an economic crisis occurred and followed by a revolution. That's the revolutions of 1848 that swept through Europe. No, it's also known as the springtime of the peoples and nations, like the years 1848 and 49. A lot was going on back then, politically speaking. After Napoleon's fall, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 restored conservative monarchies and tried to suppress liberal or nationalist movements. And at the same time, you had ethnic minorities in multi-national empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were demanding independence and autonomy. German, Italian, Hungarian, Polish, and Czech nationalists, they pushed for national unification or self-rule, while also a growing demand for constitutional government, freedom of the press and assembly, civil rights, and representative institutions, etc. And so add to this the industrialization of Europe that had, disrupted traditional forms of labor and led to urban poverty and unemployment. You also had the agrarian crisis of the 1840s, like bad potato harvests, especially in 45 and 47, which caused food shortages, famines, and high bread prices. So you have rising inequalities that created deep resentment among both the working classes and the petite bourgeoisie. And so throughout 1848, you had a series of people's upheavals and uprisings all through Europe, with the aim of removing the old monarchical structures once and for all, and creating independent nation states. So it all started in Italy, January 1848, and it spread through the whole continent after it. And Marx was particularly interested in how the revolutions turned up in France. On the 24th of February, 1848, the monarchy of July of King Louis Philippe was overthrown and replaced by the Second Republic with Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew. He became the president, and Marx and Engels, they published their Communist Manifesto on the 21st of February. But he didn't foresee the exact events of these movements, of course, but he expected that revolutions will soon spark because of the contradictory nature of capitalism. The same occurred in the Panic of 1857. It was a major global crisis, economic crisis, one of the first truly worldwide financial crises, and it had significant economic and political consequences. Again, we had similar causes as those in 1848. The world economy, especially in Europe and the US, had been growing rapidly due to industrialization. This led to overproduction in manufacturing, especially textiles, and speculative bubbles in railways and lands. Prices of goods like cotton, grain, and metal collapsed, hurting both industrialists and farmers. You also had the crisis in banking. The crisis actually started with the collapse of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, a banking institution in the US in August 1857. And because credit and capital markets were becoming globalized, a wave of bank runs followed across the United States and then in Europe. And so the crash spread rapidly from the US to Britain, France, Germany, and then even Russia and even India. And as consequences, you ended up with mass unemployment in cities, bankruptcies of factories, of merchant and railroad companies. You also had collapse of trade and investment flows and a significant disruption in capitalist confidence. But as you can guess, capitalism survived these crises, both the 1848 revolutions and the crisis of 1857. The revolutions of 1848 failed, leading Marx to reflect on his ideas in the Communist Manifesto, because the outcome of 1848 wasn't socialism but capitalism again. And so to explain this, Marx produced two works in response to the failed revolutions: his Class Struggles in France of 1848 and 1850, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. This is where he gives detailed analysis of France's revolution and its aftermath. Marx argued that there were three blocks at the 1848 revolutions. You had the monarchists, you had the bourgeoisie, and you had the working class, where these two had the monarchists as a common enemy. So the bourgeoisie and the working class, they were opposed to the monarchy. But the revolution itself was initially led by the bourgeoisie, who sought to overthrow feudal and abolitionist monarchist regimes to establish constitutional governments and market economies. However, once the working class began demanding social equality and economic justice, which were incompatible with the bourgeoisie's demands, the bourgeoisie turned against them and allied with the old ruling classes to crush the revolt, like during the June Days uprisings. By 1851, yes, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, so again Napoleon's nephew, he staged a coup and became Emperor Napoleon III, bringing an end to the Second Republic. It was a reactionary outcome, showing that the bourgeoisie preferred dictatorship to proletarian power. What a shock. So Marx, faced with this, had to integrate, this revolution as another necessary stage towards communism. Obviously, this wasn't the final stage to end capitalism and transition to communism, since capitalism survived, but it was one of the many stages towards that transition. So the advantages of the 1848 revolution were that it exposed the limits of bourgeois liberalism. It showed that only the proletariat could carry the revolution to its true conclusion, the abolition of class society. It demonstrated the need for an independent, organized working class party that would later become, communist parties. And concerning the crisis of 1857, which again didn't bring the collapse of capitalism again, Marx too had to rework his theory, this time systematizing it. Marx saw the crisis as a confirmation of his theoretical expectation that capitalism is inherently prone to a periodic crisis due to contradictions within its own mode of production. And so he produced the Grundrisse, and it is a set of rough economic manuscripts written during the winter of 1857 and 1858. Its full title is Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, and so that's what Grundrisse means, outlines. So it's not a finished book, but it is a collection of notebooks, about 800 pages, written as preparatory work for preparatory work for what would later become Volume 1 of Das Kapital, published in 1867, and then the planned volumes 2 and 3. So in the Grundrisse, he started placing more emphasis on the material conditions needed for socialism to emerge. He no longer assumed that revolution would automatically follow from economic crisis or proletarian suffering. Instead, capitalism needed to develop its productive forces further before socialism could be viable. Now, this simply means that he argued for more productivism. Capitalism cannot be overthrown until it has fulfilled its role in developing the productive forces. A premature revolution, before those forces are fully developed, would be doomed to failure. But the point is that he revised his early views and optimism and started systematizing his thought, which will eventually lead to a complete abandonment of productivism. So in the Grundrisse, Marx worked through commodity, value, money, capital, surplus value, and labor, technology and automation, the contradictions of capital, contradiction of capitalism, the concept of pre-capitalist modes of production, the relation between base and superstructure, notions of fixed capital, his methodology, etc. But especially there's a new concept that appeared in the Grundrisse, which will be very important in Marx's ecological thought. All of this accumulated in his Das Kapital, and we can already see that Marx revised a lot of his assumptions since the Communist Manifesto, and because of that the manifesto is insufficient as a basis for understanding Marx's ideas overall. So you cannot say that Marx is a productivist because you cannot just rely on the manifesto alone. But even Capital cannot be taken to express his final conclusions. As you know, Marx only completed the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867. He died 14 years later in 1881, and during that decade he never finished volume 2 and 3. These volumes were actually edited and published by Engels after Marx's death, and given that Engels was a productivist, and even more productivist than Marx ever was, so as a result there are several instances where Marx's later ideas ended up distorted because of over-editing and the differences between Engels's views and Marx's. So Saito argues that it isn't really in Capital, and even less in the second and third volume, that we can find the shifts in his thought, especially with regards to productivism. Rather, the real conclusions of Marx can be found in the materials he gathered in those 14 years to complete the two volumes. Those can be found in his notebooks, which Engels discarded as a big part of he discarded a big part of them in his editing of both volumes, and so Engels was concerned with emphasizing the systemic nature of Marx's work in Capital, and so he only selected the passages that wouldn't be at odds with the first volume, which was still supporting productivism. So a lot of Marx's late ideas didn't make their way to the other two volumes in circulation, and therefore they remained unknown and concealed to the public. Only a handful of niche scholars had access to them. Up until then, Marx's critique of capitalism had a limit, since he believed that capitalism was a necessary stage to transition to communism. His criticism of capitalism couldn't be absolute. But in those 14 years, his criticism deepened to the point where he discarded that stage and started advocating for a transition to communism without the necessity of capitalism or even productivism. It is only then that Marx theorized an actual break from the Anthropocene, and therefore how to survive the environmental crisis. The fact that no one besides a few researchers had access to Marx's late notebooks and research notes led to a serious misunderstanding of Marx's own thoughts, and ultimately it led to taking Marx as at odds with ecology. Marx's ultimate view is that communism is in reality inherently ecological. And it is this misunderstanding that led Marx's bad reputation among environmentalists, which according to Saito is ironic, since without Marx they cannot do shit about climate change. And among even people from the left who cannot shake off the specter of Stalinism whenever Marx is brought up in political conversation. He says, this misunderstanding has had major consequences. It wouldn't be hyperbolic to say that this distortion of Marx's thought resulted in the birth of the monster known as Stalinism and humanity's ongoing inability to look at the present environmental crisis directly in its hideous face. We must correct this misunderstanding before it is too late. All right, then let's correct that misunderstanding. So Saito reminds us of what that misunderstanding consists of, concretely. If we boil down everything wrong with Marx's mainstream interpretation to just one concept, it would be this: that misunderstanding is the progressive view of history. Saito writes, it is the attribution to Marx of the optimistic idea that the modernization brought about by capitalism will in the end bring about the liberation of humanity. Capitalism, he thought, might bring about the exploitation of workers and the destruction of the environment for a time, but it would also bring about innovation through competition, and that would raise productivity, and this rise in productivity would prepare the conditions for everyone in the future society to enjoy a rich, free lifestyle. Let's call this way of thinking the progressive view of history. So this progressive view of history is explicit in the Communist Manifesto. Marx did believe all of this. He believed that history isn't just linear, but progressive. This is a view he got from Hegel, who believed that history moves in stages, that each was better, more advanced, more rational than the one before it. And that all of those stages were just preparation for the next stage. So everything that happens in history is necessary. It keeps on going until it reaches the final stage, which is the end of history. Now, the final stage for Hegel is the realization of human freedom. It's not we suddenly don't have time or events anymore in the end of history, but humanity becomes progressively more conscious of its freedom to the point where it achieves true freedom institutionalized in the modern constitutional state. Hegel believed, for example, Prussia in his time approximated this. The end of history in Hegel means the achievement of self-conscious freedom through the dialectical development of reason. Each stage of reason is not a rupture with the one before it, but a synthesis and overcoming of the contradictions of the previous stages that were still not rational enough. And this is supposed to culminate in the modern liberal state. And so this progress for Hegel that leads to true human freedom is the unfolding of spirit, of Geist, or reason realizing itself through a dialectical process. Each historical stage is a manifestation of Geist, of spirit, that contains contradictions that are overcome in the next stage until spirit achieves its final ultimate form. Marx accepts Hegel's view that history is a dialectical process driven by contradictions, but he radically materializes it. For Marx, history is not the unfolding of Geist, but the development of material social relations and modes of productions. He replaces Hegel's idealism with historical materialism. Class struggle becomes the motor of history instead of spirit. So you have slave versus master in a pre-feudalist society, serf versus lord in feudalism, and then workers versus capitalists in capitalist societies. And so the struggle is supposed to be the last, because once its contradictions are overcome, and once the contradictions of capitalist societies are overcome, we get communism. Communism is where these conflicts are resolved, when classes are abolished and where true human freedom can begin, where people collectively control their social relations. So, since every stage is preparing for the next one, every stage comes with the necessary conditions for the next. This again means that you can only have communism if you go through capitalism, making then capitalism necessary. And also you assume that capitalism brings within itself the conditions and proper tools to bring communism. And that's what Marx claimed. Capitalism, like any other stage before it, is riddled with contradictions. And so these contradictions will lead to its doom. Capitalism will destroy itself. But once that happens, it's not Armageddon or the apocalypse, but communism, the true human liberation that awaits us. So all the suffering, misery, and nature's destruction that we go through is just temporary. At the same time, capitalism is giving us the means to emancipate ourselves from this suffering and exploitation, because it brings about modernization and innovation. So rises in productivity, which means that it is now possible to have rich and enjoyable lifestyles for everyone. The only thing in the way is the capitalist mode of production and the capitalist mode of redistribution. So we have the means to produce abundantly to the point where everyone can enjoy a rich and carefree lifestyle, but only a small minority get to enjoy it because they own those means. But then if everyone owns those means, then everyone will enjoy happy lifestyle, right? This will eventually happen since capitalism will destroy itself under its own contradictions and the revolution will seize the means of production. This is bound to happen because, again, history is progressive. It moves naturally through stages towards its best final stage. Communism is a better, more progressive, more rational stage than capitalism. Therefore, capitalism is bound to happen. This is historical materialism, the idea that everything is materialistic, it's made of matter. Now that is materialism. Human history is also materialistic, and this obeys laws that push it towards a progressive evolution. What we call history is nothing but the changes of material conditions, especially economic relations and class struggle. That's what explains historical changes. But these changes have a course, they have a teleological trajectory. They are driven by a rational force towards the best possible state of being, hence they are progressive. Now, what is the problem with this view of seeing history as progress? Well, it's its non-ecological implications which stem from two distinctive features of this view: productivism and Eurocentrism. You see, productivism, properly defined by Saito, is this. It's a form of celebratory modernization theory that states that the productivity fostered by capitalism rises, the problems of poverty and environmental damage will naturally be solved, eventually leading to the liberation of mankind. So this already resembles the measures we've criticized in the first chapter. The idea that the environmental crisis will be solved by raises in productivity. Let capitalism do its thing, and we will get to the miracle technology that will absorb or reduce to zero our emissions. Here, it's kind of the same thing. Communism is like one of those technologies. Since we know in communism the problems of class struggle and environmental destruction will be solved, then we can let capitalism run as much as it needs to in order to raise productivity levels to the necessary point to bring the transition towards communism. And this leads to the second feature, which is Eurocentrism, which is the view that everyone else in everywhere else in the modern world, the same trajectory taken everywhere else in the modern world, you will have the same trajectory taken by Europe. Okay, everywhere else in the modern world, the same trajectory taken in Europe must be implemented. This is Eurocentrism. Since the last stage before human liberty is in Europe, then everyone else must do the same. They must take Europe as a model and implement capitalism too and catch up with the European continent. That's also a direct consequence of the linear view of history as progress. Europe is the most progressive continent in the world, so everyone must do the same. So Saito explains Eurocentrism as, according to such a view of history, Western Europe, with its high levels of productivity, has reached a higher step in history. This means that the rest of the world must be modernized under capitalism to catch up, just as Western Europe was. This is where Eurocentrism comes in. So you can easily see the colonialist implications coming from miles away with this view. And now it's clear. We start with productivism. With productivism, its downside is that it gives the perfect excuse to completely ignore the destructive effect production has on the environment. Capitalist production has on the environment. All of this destruction is just necessary and is trivialized because, you know, what's a few polluted oceans and deforested land compared to the joys once humanity is liberated? We will eventually bring back nature to its pre-polluted era once we understand how it works. But to understand how it works, you need science, and science is a process of trials and errors. Of course, we're going to need to destroy parts of the natural world in our quest to understand it. But once we get there, once we understand it completely, once we dominate nature, once we get the completion of humanity's conquest of nature, then we can engineer it to our will. No more pollution, no more food shortages, no more disasters, no more wars and inequalities, and all of that depends on how we raise productivity. This is the very limit of productivism in relation to ecology. while it claims that if it destroys the natural world, it will eventually restore it once it reaches the necessary levels to transition to communism, in reality, it just destroys it. Productivism overlooks the ugly truth that the rise in productivity under capitalism is the very thing destroying the environment. And of course, this is a destruction with no chances of restoring it. Like all the optimistic technologies that we dream of, by the time those technologies come into existence, it would be probably and most certainly too late. The planet will already be uninhabitable by that time. So Marx is therefore wrong here, and the environmental movements in the second half of the 20th century were right to point out this flaw and repudiate it. There's no bigger threat to nature than Prometheanism coupled with productivism. Prometheanism is the view that man's dominion over nature is justified and necessary, that only through the subjugation of nature to man's will can man enjoy a free and meaningful life. So here we dominate nature in order to increase productivity. So again, this Marx did embrace explicitly in his early works. Saito quotes from the Communist Manifesto, the first line in the first chapter, bourgeois and the proletarians. He says the one that starts with the famous phrase, "The history of all existing society is the history of class struggles." And in it, you can see the linear progression of history driven by the bourgeoisie. Marx says that the bourgeoisie has simplified the antagonisms within society because it reduced it to just two big camps, or is reducing it to just two big camps: proletarians and capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and also they revolutionized industry. The bourgeoisie revolutionized it in the sense of bringing the Anthropocene. He explicitly talks about how the new modern industry has expanded all over the globe through its markets. The need of a constant expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe, spreads the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere. It must settle everywhere. It must establish connections everywhere. So human activity is now everywhere. No parts of nature are left untouched by modern industry. And in this sense, it did bring a refreshing sense of freedom. As Marx says, the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part and put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations and torn asunder the feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors. Man can now do whatever he likes and can pursue freely his self-interests. He can work for himself instead for masters. But of course, this freedom is all but freedom, since, like he also says, it's freedom for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. By revolutionizing the means of production, the bourgeoisie also revolutionized the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society, of man towards man, but also relations with nature. And this is where the quote by Saito is important. So this is Saito quoting from the Manifesto in the same chapter. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's force to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor. So here Marx is kind of celebrating the bourgeoisie. He laments that the bourgeoisie had displaced traditional modes of production and transformed social relations, even among families, to just money. He laments the exploitation of workers, but he also views this as a necessary step for the future emancipation of all. Once the revolution arrives and the means of production revolutionized by the bourgeoisie are democratized, like they become the property of the proletariat, then all the woes that the bourgeoisie brought along will all sorts of antagonisms in history, all of those will be over and forever. In the subjugation of nature's forces to man, it's what is going to get us there. Then, if that is what's going to get us, then it's not a high price to pay. Especially when you also believe that you will restore the damage to nature once the workers seize the means of production. So this criticism of early Marx is kind of valid. The reading of the Communist Manifesto, when you read the manifesto, you are certainly tempted to discard Marx as someone who doesn't believe in planetary boundaries or ecological ceilings, that nature has no limits, or that its limits can be overcome through science and technology. Like Saito says, if we limit Marx to only his early writings, we are then justified in asserting that red and green can never mix. Like Manifesto's Marx truly lacks an ecological dimension. And he is also dangerously underestimating capitalism's resilience in face of its contradictions, and overestimate productivity's potential for humans' liberation and for creating, affluent societies. Thankfully, Marx didn't embrace such naive views by the time he got to Das Kapital. While it is true that when he wrote Das Kapital, he was still a productivist, but that productivism of his was largely revised because of a new concept that appeared in Marx's writings. The first time it appeared was in his London notebooks, in the notebook titled Reflections of March 1851, but it was in the Grundrisse that it appears in an attempt to include it within its systematized theory. And that concept is metabolism, and it also appears in Das Kapital, although that will depend on your translation. If you have the Samuel Moore and Edward Eveling's translation, which is the one available at marxist.org, you won't find the term anywhere, but you will find it in Ben Folk's translation, which is the Penguin edition. So, why is that relevant? Well, that's because, like the Commons, the concept of metabolism is actually very important to understand Marx. Saito even argues that Das Kapital is actually a theory of metabolism, the systematization of Marx's thought, which he already undertook in the Grundrisse, was supposed to lead to a systemized theory of metabolism. And because Marx's whole philosophical project in Das Kapital was to describe the relation between capital, the concept, not the book. The whole project is about highlighting the relation between capital and nature. And this concept of metabolism is crucial to understand the nature of this relation, and even the meaning of what we said last time, that communism is how the planet should be managed as the form of commons. So what made Marx change his views and started to pay more attention to this concept of metabolism that was nowhere to be found in the Communist Manifesto and all of his works in the 1840s? Well, it was Marx's engagement with the works of Justus von Liebig, which we already talked about extensively in our video on Marx's eco-socialism. Liebig, as a reminder, was a German chemist who is considered one of the founding figures of modern agricultural chemistry and biochemistry, and Marx took a serious interest in what he had to say about agriculture. The first time we know he read Leibniz was also in 1851, the same year he wrote about metabolism for the first time. But he knew about metabolism before reading Leibniz. We know this because we know that he read the 4th edition of Organic Chemistry in its applications to agriculture and physiology, more commonly known as Agricultural Chemistry. We know that Marx read this book in July 1851, so before he wrote the notebooks of March 1851, in which the concept appears. So Marx was already taking an interest in this concept, but it was Leibniz that made him pay more attention to it, to the point where the concept became central. And that took some time. Even the way he used it in the Grundrisse, although it is more sophisticated than in Reflection, is kind of used in the same limited way. Here I am using Karl Marx's eco-socialism as a reference for these claims, because in Slowdown, Saito jumps ahead to the time Marx took Liebig's concept of metabolism seriously. So in Reflection, so the notebook of March 1851, that term was used to describe social relations mediated by money in capitalist society compared to pre-capitalist societies where it was mediated by social roles. Like in pre-capitalist societies, your ways of interacting with others was restricted to your social rank. The rank that you are born into determines what you can do and dictates your relationships with others. In capitalism, however, there is no official power dictating for you how to interact. Your metabolic interactions find another universal medium that technically everyone can have or have access to, and that is money. So metabolism here is mostly social. In the Grundrisse, however, and probably after reading Leibniz, the concept becomes more systematic and materialist. He identifies 3 meanings of metabolism here, and he continued to do so until Das Kapital and later on. So there are 3 meanings for metabolism. There is the metabolic interaction between humans and nature. There is the metabolism of society, sometimes called mental metabolism, and 3, there is the metabolism of nature. In Das Kapital too, we find these 3 meanings for metabolism, but it was at this time that he became more engaged with Leibniz. His first serious engagement with Leibniz came in 1865, so 2 years after he started writing Volume 1 of Das Kapital, because he started working on Volume 1 in 1863. And so the year before Leibniz, he published his 7th edition of Agricultural Chemistry, which Marx read in the course of 1865. And in 1867, Das Kapital was published almost 20 years after the Manifesto. So the first meaning of metabolism between humans and nature, refers to the process of labor. How human beings have access to raw materials, and through labor and tools they transform the earth, and is perhaps the most important metabolism here. Saito says this, he says, what's key here is that Marx, taking a cue from Leibniz, began to develop a theory of metabolism as he worked on Das Kapital. Humanity ceaselessly acts upon nature as it produces, consumes, and discards various things as part of conducting life on Earth. Marx refers to this reciprocal cycle as the metabolic interaction between himself and nature. So you'll find this formulation in chapter 7 of Das Kapital on the labor process, and in eco-socialism, Marx's eco-socialism, by the way, because Saito also quotes directly from that chapter, but then he makes a mistake and he writes chapter 5. So just in case you get confused, it is chapter 7, not chapter 5. The importance of this metabolism is because our survival will depend on it. There are ways of interacting with nature that can lead us to our death, and so these ways also depend on how we interact with each other, of course. Like these metabolisms are related to one another. The second metabolism is how humans relate to each other in society. In capitalist societies, it becomes through circulation of commodities and exchange of use values, like nutrient flow in a body. This, of course, has an impact on how we interact with nature, so the first, metabolism, and the way we interact with nature has also an impact on the third, metabolism, which refers to natural decay or transformation without human intervention. So to understand this, let's take an example. As Saito says, nature, of course, consists of many cyclical processes that are completely independent of humanity. These include the photosynthesis, the food chain, the replenishment of nutrients in the soil. Like, nature is self-sustaining because it revives itself in cycles. It undergoes cyclical processes that allow it to recharge itself so that it can sustain life. Photosynthesis, the food chain, the replenishment of nutrients in the soil, all these are cyclical processes that, if they are disrupted, life would become unsustainable. So Saito gives the example of salmon, the fish. The reproduction cycle of salmon is characterized by anadromy, the movement from salt water to fresh water to reproduce, and semelparity, meaning that most species die after a single reproductive event. Every year, usually during the fall, salmon returns from the ocean to the freshwater stream or rivers where it were born, often traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers upstream. And upon arrival, females, they dig a nest in the gravel riverbed using their tails, and males compete for access to females. Dominant males release sperm, known as milt, and the females, well, they lay eggs. And so fertilization occurs externally. For most species, like the Pacific salmon, spawning is followed by death. And so their decaying bodies return nutrients to the freshwater ecosystem, and so supporting plants, insects, and even forest animals. But there are some species like the Atlantic salmon that for a small percentage can sometimes survive and return to the sea after spawning, a strategy called heteroparity. I think that's how it is pronounced, I think, heteroparity. Anyways, others are eaten by animals like bears and foxes who ambush them during the annual salmon runs as they try to swim upstream to spawn. And so this way they also become nutrients for the soil in the forest via those animals' waste. So you also have the leaves that fall from the trees in these forests. They also enrich the soil, and some of them fall into the streams to become food for the aquatic insects, the crayfish, and other tiny organisms living in the water, or to create, shade, allowing small fish to hide and grow. And so this is how the salmon, thus, enables natural metabolic cycles, which are part of the metabolism of nature. Humans too not only depend on nature to sustain themselves for labor, but also for basic biological needs. We are also part of nature. Thus, we too have a metabolic relationship to the physical world in the same way the salmon does. Breathing, eating, and shitting are how we participate too in these constant cycles, these cyclical processes of ingestion and excretion. And that's why we can live on this planet. Nature's well-functioning metabolism is our biologically determined condition for human existence. But our metabolic interactions with nature through labor is also cyclical. When we take the raw materials from nature, those materials need to go back so that we can extract them again, right? It would be a disaster if we take wood from forests, but that wood doesn't grow back again. At one point we will run out of it. And so our interactions with nature also rely on cycles and regeneration. And so this is where Marx's ecological shift becomes deeply relevant. In the 7th edition of Agricultural Chemistry, Liebisch introduced a new concept called the robbery of the soil. It is to describe the sort of unsustainable extraction of nutrients from the soil under capitalist agriculture. It refers to a mode of farming that exploits the land intensively to maximize short-term profits, while failing to replenish the soil's fertility. In other words, capitalism disrupts the metabolic interactions in all three categories. Already in the Grundrisse, Marx points to the different, unique way humans interact with nature and sets us apart from other animals who are only part of nature's metabolism. We, however, manage to separate ourselves from nature's metabolism and from another metabolism with nature's metabolisms. What ties us to nature isn't just the biological conditions for existence, but labor. That's what Marx says in the 7th chapter of Das Kapital. And it ties man to nature in a specific way. That is, that man acts upon nature rather than just being acted upon. He transforms it, he controls it, and regulates it according to his own plans, will, or imagination. In other words, he opposes himself to nature as one of her own forces. He, not nature, sets in motion arms and legs, head and hands. He controls the natural forces of his body in order to appropriate nature's production according to his own wants. Therefore, by acting on the external world and changing it, he at the same time changes his own nature. And as such, man's nature is never fixed, unlike that of a spider or a bee. Marx in chapter 7 still compares human beings to spiders and bees. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee resembles an architect in the construction of her hive. But as he says, what distinguishes the worst architect from the best bee is that the architect has a mental structure in his imagination of the building before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, he gets a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only makes a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own. That's great, but it also makes man too OP for his own good sometimes. Like the forms that labor takes will be a game changer. And yes, labor goes through different forms during different periods with major consequences for the metabolic interaction between nature and men, which also have consequences on all types of metabolic interactions. In capitalism, the metabolic interaction between nature and man takes on a very unsettling form. Since now the point of labor is to increase profit, man interacts with nature only through those lenses. He only sees what's valuable in nature only insofar as it brings profits. It therefore manipulates the metabolic interaction between man and nature so as to always prioritize increasing profit. And so, what can go wrong with that? Well, everything. Turns out this is not very compatible with nature's limits and its metabolic functioning. To always prioritize increasing profit means you exhaust both humans and nature. You only see them as resources for more profits, so you exploit the former by by forcing them, to work long hours so that you can squeeze as much profit as you can from their labor. And you extract power and resources from the latter until you plunder it and suck it dry. So, since capitalism always seeks to create as much value as they can, as quickly as possible, they don't give the required time for nature to fulfill its cycles. This leads to capital disrupting the metabolic link between humanity and nature, and each experience the consequences of this severed bond. Physical and mental ailments stemming from extensively long hours of arduous labor are manifestations of this disruption, as are ecological destruction and exhaustion of natural resources. So, this, from the perspective of productivism, can be overlooked. After all, if productivism is the belief that this is a necessary step to spur technological innovation, which will then develop and introduce new ways to maximize the efficiency of humanity and nature, which means reducing the costs and burdens, then this is not a high price to pay. Plus, we cannot deny that this increased efficiency has created hitherto unheard of levels of wealth. So it can seem like a small price to pay again. Given how, since the beginning of its existence, humanity was at the mercy of the natural world, of predators, of shortages, diseases, we cannot just tell everyone now that we can produce such amount of wealth easily to roll back to the Dark Ages. Plus, with the right efficiency, we can still produce as much without the negative effects. But to get there, you still need to go through this uneasy step. You are going to temporarily disrupt natural cycles and exploit human labors, but at the end, communism awaits. But this is wishful thinking. Productivism holds on to the belief that the negative effects of capitalism will eventually go away and the metabolism of nature will be restored while keeping productivity levels high for more and more profit. And there won't ever be a level at which the capitalist will say, okay, we've had enough, now it's time to switch to communism. First, even if we get to that stage, it would be, like I said, probably too late. Plus, the capitalist stage will keep going indefinitely as it always keeps surviving its crisis. The only thing it cannot survive is the destruction of planetary resources, which it will keep destroying until there is nothing left. And as such, the Earth's ecological process, its metabolism, exists independently of and incompatibly with capital. What capital does is change this metabolism to suit its needs. It creates another metabolism that works perfectly for itself. It guarantees its growth endlessly, but it is deeply unsustainable. That metabolism is a system that relies on another biggest system. If that one is destroyed, then capitalism is destroyed too. But if it gets destroyed like that, it will also take us all down with it. Quote, as we've seen, capital's unlimited movement to increase its own profits has proven itself to be constitutionally incompatible with the cycles of nature. This incompatibility is the most fundamental cause of the present climate crisis, the Anthropocene itself being its ultimate consequence. So this is all to say that capitalism may at first seem like it's working perfectly, that it is spurring unprecedented wealth and innovation, but after a certain point, its negative effects that can, that come to the fore, and they will not go away. And as much as we try to make capitalism compatible with ecology, or think that we can build a post-capitalist society on a communism that requires capitalism as a necessary step, the result will be the same. A dead planet. The point is, capitalism disrupts the metabolisms, creating a metabolic rift which cannot be repaired. Marx actually uses the expression irreparable rift when discussing metabolism under the effects of capitalism. Saito quotes directly from Marx here. In this way, large-scale land ownership produces conditions that provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process between social and metabolism and natural metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of the soil. The result of this is a squandering of the vitality of the soil, and trade carries this devastation far beyond the bounds of a single country. Okay, let's first analyze the first sentence. Capitalism, here it's large-scale ownership, which we will explain in a minute. Capitalism provokes an irreparable rift in the interdependent process between social and natural metabolism, meaning in the interdependent process between man and nature. So, the bond that ties man and nature is severed in ways that cannot be fixed or restored under capitalism. That's the main point. The rift is irreparable. And why is that? Well, let's look about at that sentence. It says that the natural metabolism is prescribed by the natural laws of the soil. But that means that the interdependent process between man and nature also depends on the soil's natural laws. For a well-functioning relationship between social metabolisms and natural metabolisms, that is, for a well-functioning metabolism between man and nature, we need to organize that interaction according to the laws of the soil, the natural laws of the soil. Meaning that if we act on the soil in ways that are contradictory to its natural laws, we are going to cause a metabolic rift. And then the next sentence says that the result of this rift is the squandering of the soil's vitality. That's the consequence. The soil loses its fertility. As you can guess, a soil that loses its fertility is a soil on which you cannot grow anything, so it becomes a barren land, a soil that cannot sustain life forms. That's precisely what we have to avoid. So in capitalism, we have a way to manage the soil that causes an irreparable metabolic rift, and the consequences of that are the squandering of the soil's vitality. And then you have trade. When countries trade with one another, so globalization, this devastation of the soil goes to other countries as well. It spreads like a pandemic. Now, I want to talk about the origins of that passage. So that passage that we just read is from the third volume of Das Kapital. It's from chapter 47, the famous chapter on ground rent, section 5, sharecropping and small-scale peasant ownership. It's in the paragraph before last of the chapter, and in that paragraph, from which quote is taken, it's about comparing small-scale land ownership with large-scale land ownership. The passage that we quoted obviously deals with large-scale land ownership, and Marx is highly critical of it since it causes this irreparable rift. But Marx is also critical of small-scale land ownership. For him, small-scale land ownership means that you have private property, but on a small scale, which is like we talked about when we addressed the private individual laborers in our video on Karl Marx's last time when we talked about the commons. So you have a private individual laborers which own, their own means of production, but they don't use them collectively. Okay, they remain isolated, and so they don't collectively coordinate production. And as Marx says, in small-scale land ownership, isolated labor predominates over social labor. In this aspect, both material and intellectual wealth and the development of reproduction are ruled out under these circumstances. The peasants owning these small-scale lands, because their labor is isolated, cannot produce abundant wealth. So they remain materially limited, but also intellectually limited. Development of production requires innovation and new ways of thinking, which can only achieve through collective action. And so for those reasons, Marx writes, their agriculture doesn't develop and therefore remains irrational. He says that the conditions for a rational agriculture are also ruled out under isolated labor. On the other hand, he sees that in large-scale land ownership, you have wealth and innovation, innovative methods of reproduction, but it remains irrational because it destroys the soil. And here we have to talk about the population. The reason why you have small-scale land ownership is because most of the population is agricultural. Most people live in rural areas. So if you divide the land on a great number of people, the lands will be small. But the advantage is that although small-scale land ownership is irrational, it doesn't necessarily cause a metabolic rift, because since everyone is working on their land and consuming what they produce on their own land, on the same land that they work on, the soil never gets impoverished in nutrients. Nutrients taken out of the soil to make food, for example, go back in the form of waste. And so these are the natural laws of the soil. It's the requirement of soil replenishment. For a soil to remain fertile, the extracted nutrients must circle back into it. And as such, the natural metabolism and the social metabolism can maintain a metabolic interaction. But in large-scale land ownership, you have a few people owning large portions of land, which means that the size of the agricultural population has decreased. So what happened to the rest? What happened to these populations who are no longer on the rural lands? Well, they ended up in towns and cities. And so now you have an ever-growing industrial population crammed together in large towns. And so these industrial populations, they require food, which must be produced on large-scale farms, so you put a huge burden on the land to be able to keep up. And second, because the industrial population consumes that food in cities, the waste doesn't go back to the land. It actually goes, in the sewages. So the soil doesn't regain its nutrients back, which leads to the soil losing its fertility. The natural law that prescribes the interaction between man and nature are violated, and hence all three metabolisms enter a crisis. And so this is the metabolic rift. And Marx insists that under capitalism, it cannot be fixed whatsoever. This is also known as the robbery of the soil. You rob the soil of its nutrients. Now, there's a footnote. There, note 79, where Saito says that he took the passage from the manuscript of Volume 3, written by Marx before Engels' editing, which has slight differences. He also points to this in his Marx's eco-socialism, because he also quotes that sentence, and in a footnote 83 there, he says that translations often overlook the fact that Engels modified the sentence about the rift and obscured its meaning. So, in the original manuscript, which is published in the Mega, Section 2, Volume 4, Part 2, yeah, some volumes are split into parts. Anyway, so in the Mega, the passage about metabolic rift is different. I'm going to show you the German passage of the manuscript in the Mega, then the German passage in Engels's edition, and then the Penguin edition, which translates the edited version of Engels. And so I'm not going to read in German because it's going to be very awful, but this is right here. This is the passage from the Mega. Now I highlighted it in yellow. So this is the passage. Now what I want you to focus on is that in that passage, when he writes these two words, okay, these two words, I'll look at them carefully. I'm not going to try to. Okay, I'm going to try to pronounce them, but I'm going to butcher it. So. Gesellschaftlichen und Naturlichen. So, Gesellschaftlichen und Naturlichen. So, what he's saying in this whole paragraph, in this whole passage, so this sentence, in the original manuscript, the rift occurs in the connection between the social and the natural. That's Gesellschaftlichen und Naturlichen. So the social and the natural. Okay. So I want you to really focus on that. Okay. Focus on that, and now compare it with how Engels edited the manuscript. The word Naturlichen. I guess that, again, sorry for my pronunciation. So that word was taken out. It is written like this. So you have the Gesellschaftlichen, but then you don't have und Naturlichen like in the original manuscript. Instead, you have instead you jump directly to the next part of the sentence. Durch die Naturgesetze des Lebens, okay, which you can also find here. So you find it in the manuscript. You find it in the actual manuscript, but before that you had that und Naturlichen, which was taken out of the manuscript in Engels. So in Engels, that starts to mean the rift occurs in the social by means of the natural laws of the soil. And so when you go to the Penguin edition, which translates the edited version by Engels, it is translated as an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. So here it suggests that the social metabolism is the one prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. It's very different from the original meaning, and we cannot be sure what Engels actually meant by this formulation. So that's an example of how Engels' editing obscured a lot of Marx's ecological thought. Anyway, so that idea that the soil's nutrients aren't coming back to the soil is Leibniz's idea. In that whole passage, Marx is discussing Leibniz's concept of robbery of the soil. Like I said, Marx started studying Leibniz heavily in 1865, and so the chapter on ground rent, Marx started writing it since 1863. It could have been added in volume 1, but he put it aside because he wanted to learn more about agriculture, and that's why it was integrated in volume 3. But already in volume 1, he discussed the concept of robbery agriculture, the way of doing agriculture in ways that rob the soil of its fertility. In volume 1, section 10, large-scale agriculture and industry of the 15th chapter, machinery and large-scale industry, as well as in the section 5, the struggle of the normal working day of chapter 10, the working day. In both sections, he writes that capitalism disrupts or disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth by preventing the return of the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. Hence, capitalism hinders the operation of eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil, and drawing a parallel between the soil's exploitation and the workers under capitalism. It robs the worker of his physical strength, of his means of subsistence, as well as his mental and cognitive faculties, just like it robs the soil of its nutrients. It produces the deterioration of human labor power by robbing it of its normal moral and physical conditions of development and activity, as well as the premature exhaustion and death of this labor power itself. So this is the shortening of life. Okay, it is shortening the life of labor power, so of men, of workers, by making them work long hours until they die of exhaustion. In the same way as a greedy farmer snatches more produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. That's how he frames it in the Working Day chapter, and Saito quotes him when he writes explicitly in the 15th chapter on large-scale industry that all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. And right after that, Marx adds that all progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. That's why he takes the US as an example, so the United States, saying that their method of agriculture, which undermines the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker, is bound to destroy itself. If it manages to survive, it's only because it exhausts the resources from elsewhere. So the point is, agriculture under capitalism leads to an ecological catastrophe, which Marx foresaw and rang the alarm about it. Since with trade, this robbery process takes over the entire world, it signals both the Anthropocene and the climate crisis ahead. So Saito writes, capitalism will undermine the conditions necessary for sustainable production by disrupting and opening up a rift in the metabolism connecting humans and nature. Capitalism makes the sustainable management of this metabolic connection impossible and thus hinders the further development of society. So Far from uncritically celebrating the productive forces of modernization, Marx makes a clear repudiation of the development of technology and productivity to further the unlimited profit-seeking of capital. So in the 15 years between first volume's publication and his death, Marx published almost nothing, but kept the entire time studying the natural sciences such as biology, chemistry, botany, geology, mineralogy, to understand as much as he can natural metabolisms. In my video on Saito's book Marx's Eco-Socialism, we've seen the other influences besides Liebisch that he studied intensively during that period in London. We've seen that he didn't stop at the robbery of the soil, since he also grew critical of Liebisch's solution to the rift. In chapter 5 of Marx's Eco-Socialism, we saw that what was wrong with Liebisch's idea, that we can replenish the soil through artificial fertilizers, but this is ineffective to close the rift that capitalism opened. We also talked about the incapability of capitalism to close that rift, meant that we have to consider Malthusianism, which is what Marx wanted to avoid. So Marx started to look for other means to achieve a sustainable economic development without relying on productivism. So the research notebooks that he produced from 1868 to the year of his death are full of excerpts from natural scientists, all trying to find alternatives to robbery agriculture that simply refuses to go away. It is precisely these notebooks that contain Marx's broad ecological criticism, critiques of capitalism, and his alternatives to get communism without having to go through capitalism. Marx saw that robbery agriculture is also related to other ecological issues as diverse as the over-harvesting of forest land, the waste of fossil fuels, and the extinction of seeds as arising from the contradictions of capitalism. It is these issues that don't seem to get overcome anytime soon by capitalism that pushed him to abandon completely productivism. One particular scientist influenced him during this period more than Liebisch, and it was probably him that made Marx nail the final nail in productivism's coffin. And we already mentioned this scientist in our video on Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. It was the German agriculturist and botanist Karl Nikolaus Fraß. So in 1847, Fraß published a book that once Marx read in 1868, caused a fundamental change in his perspective because it introduced the role of the climate in agriculture. So this book is Climate and the Vegetable World Throughout the Ages, and it made Marx claim in a letter to Engels of March 1868 that the book is very interesting, especially as proving that climate and flora have changed in historic times. And this, by the way, led Marx to call Fraß a Darwinist before Darwin, as well as having unconscious socialist tendencies. So what made Marx praise this man more than he praised Liebisch? For a reminder, Marx thought of Liebisch's insighting to agricultural history as surpassing those of all modern political economists combined. So if Fraß is even more admired by Marx than Liebisch, then it means that this guy has important things to say. So what's the book about? Well, in it he describes the process by which various ancient civilizations, including Mesopotamia, Egypt and Greece, among others, how they collapsed. And this is before capitalism and before the robbery of the soil. And the reason for the collapse is agriculture. So what gives? What explains that collapse? Well, according to Fraß, agriculture doesn't just depend on nutrients in the soil, but also on the climate. A change in climate can have a devastating effect on agriculture even if your soil is fully replenished. And once your agricultural system fails or falls, well, civilization will soon follow. And so this is what happened in those civilizations according to Fra. But it wasn't natural changes in the climate, rather those changes were man-made. They were the result of overharvesting forest land. It's when you remove trees and other vegetations from forest at a rate faster than it can naturally regenerate to make room for agriculture. So basically this is deforestation. So the issue is that deforestation causes changes in the climate, like rises in temperature and drying of the air, and this affects crop yields, which made the cultivation of the land more and more difficult. Fra points in his book that in his days, those regions are now arid, and they still are, whereas in the past they were fertile. In other words, in our quest to overdevelop the natural world to make it suit our desires without having a rational grasp on how it operates, it leads us to the loss of large amounts of fertile lands. In the distant past of the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greeks, that process took centuries, if not millennia, but with capitalism, the same process happens at higher speed, because we don't clear forests just for agriculture now, but we also to develop logging and transportation technologies, which would only further extend humanity's incursion into the world's forests. And so that's the danger. It is the Anthropocene. Human activity goes way beyond its limits. It also covers the domain of forests, causing disturbances in its metabolic functioning. If human activity spreads throughout the entire globe, it will be the planet's entire metabolisms that collapse, leading to a lifeless world. And so that's why Marx says that Fraze's book displays a socialist tendency. It challenges the capitalist mode of production, it challenges it head-on by exposing the plunder of nature under capitalism and calling for a sustainable relationship to the world's forest land. It was also during this time that Marx came across The Coal Question by William Stanley Jevons. Jevons, if you remember from the video on green Keynesianism, is the guy who formulated the Jevons paradox. That's when an increase in efficiency in resource use leads to an even more use of resources, which causes shortages of resources. So this is what was happening in the coal deposits in England. Jevons argued that the easy access to coal leads to a continuous shrinking of deposits. The belief was that if we consume resources more efficiently, we won't overconsume them. And that's just in theory. But in practice, however, it means that coal is cheaper, so it is more attracting. It is more attractive because it's more attracting people, investors. So even if every single person on the planet uses coal efficiently, the fact that everyone can use it leads to an increase in its consumption, even if we all use it efficiently, even if each single one of us lowered their own consumption of the resource. Another issue that Marx started studying was the extinction of seeds. It is the loss of genetic diversity in plant seeds, particularly traditional heirloom or wild seed varieties, many of which have been cultivated and passed down for generations. So this phenomenon is a major concern in agriculture, in ecology and food sovereignty, because it threatens biodiversity, food security, and the resilience of crops in the face of climate change, of pests, and also of diseases. Under capitalism and industrial agriculture, you have mass adoption of high-yield hybrid seeds, especially for wheat, for rice, and for maize, which leads to monocultures. So monoculture means that you only cultivate one type of seeds, which reduces the need for diverse seeds. And so this is because seeds become the property of companies and corporates that want to control their consumption through markets. Basically, companies want to sell you their seeds, often patent seeds, and promote genetically modified seeds like GMs or proprietary hybrid seeds that cannot be legally saved and replanted. Farmers then become dependent on purchasing new seeds each season, often not adapted to the farmer's soil, who has to abandon the seed that they traditionally use. It's quite common that indigenous and peasant communities, often the guardians of seed diversity, are displaced or pressured to abandon traditional practices so that they can buy. So not that they can, but that they must buy these modified seeds. Add to this that climate change, deforestation, and pollution threaten the habitats of wild crop relatives, and that some seed varieties are lost due to lack of proper conservation, especially in areas without access to major seed vaults. And all of these problems that keep popping up everywhere under capitalism, whenever capitalism gets involved, now you have all of these problems. These problems cannot be resolved by further increase and development of productivity. So much so that Marx began to put an emphasis on ecological degradation as the inherent contradiction in capitalism before even class struggle. Like, the main problem with capitalism is ecological disaster. So from 1868, capitalism for Marx became primary an ecological nightmare because it relies on ecological rifts that cannot be fixed by productivity. The result was a clean break from productivism here in Marx's thought. This research was Marx's way of investigating the metabolic rift opening up in various regions all over the world. It was his intent to examine these rifts and show that they demonstrated by their very existence the central contradiction within capitalism. Marx's stance, as revealed by looking at these late period notes, is completely different from an optimistic view that sees an increase in productivity as the key to conquering nature and eventually overcoming capitalism. It's obvious at this juncture that he made a clean break with productivism. But like we said a few minutes earlier, when we mentioned the US, they didn't collapse yet despite doing everything wrong in the book in regards to agriculture. So an environmental crisis doesn't necessarily lead directly to civilizational collapse. That would be too simplistic. Rather, capitalism buys itself some time by displacing its contradictions elsewhere. That's the externalization process that we explained in chapter 1. It keeps playing cat and mouse of displacement, played out at different points in history. By doing so, it simply widens the rift, taking it to global proportion. And as such, capitalism will die when it has plundered all of the resources on the earth, but the problem is that it will drag us all with it. So now, Marx started looking for an eco-socialism that fosters sustainable economic development. We need to do economy in a way that doesn't, under no circumstances, cause metabolic rifts in the first place. You don't cause a metabolic rift in the first place. And also, we need an economy that doesn't cause a metabolic rift, but also realizes human freedom. And so from 1868, that was his goal. Find a viable path to a form of socialism that could foster economic development in a sustainable manner. All of his research for the last 14 years of his life, all the books he read, all the excerpts he copied in his notebooks, all of them aimed at that. So here he completely abandoned any hopes that productivism will lead to a transition to socialism. We need an economy that doesn't cause metabolic rifts in the first place. Capitalism causes metabolic rifts, therefore it cannot serve as a transition to socialism. What needs to happen is a complete break. The revolution isn't supposed to build communist societies on the achievements or ruins of capitalism. It must break completely with capitalism. As Saito explicitly writes, Marx was, at this point, convinced that sustainable growth was impossible under capitalism, that capitalism would lead to nothing but the further intensification of nature's plunder. In other words, blindly accelerating productivity under capitalism would never pave the way for a transition to socialism. This is one major shift in Marx's thinking during this period. Rather than calling for rising productivity under capitalism, Marx now sought first to bring about a transition to a separate economic system that is socialism, and then foster sustainable economic development within that system. The vision he pursued during this period was one of eco-socialism. By the end of his life, though, Marx had progressed yet further, moving beyond even eco-socialism in his analysis. So here we must avoid misunderstanding again. Saito says that at the end of his life, Marx went even further than eco-socialism, which can be confusing. So, just to set the record straight, eco-socialism is the period of the first volume of Das Kapital, where he understood that productivism isn't the way, and so he started looking for how to make a socialism that is at the same time ecological, meaning sustainable, that doesn't cause environmental degradation in the least. So this is what he was looking for during the 1860s all the way to the 1870s. But he never clearly defined what this sustainable economy would look like precisely in relation to ecology, at least. What is characteristic of his eco-socialism period, and this we will see again in this chapter, is that it doesn't yet tackle the idea of growth itself. He clearly understood that productivism isn't the way, but productivism simply means unsustainable growth. Eco-socialism, however, means sustainable growth. How can we make growth happen while in a sustainable economy that makes a sharp break rather than a transition, no matter how radical or violent this transition may be, from capitalism? Like, we need to be more radical than the most radical of transitions of capitalism, and that's his point. But in the 1870s, he went even further, and this is where, according to Saito, he had a clear vision: degrowth communism. But we will go back to that. I just wanted to clear any misunderstanding about this, about his break from productivism, because for now this isn't degrowth yet. Okay. So as I said, we will go back to that. But here, what is clear is that this shift in his thought meant that Marx no longer abides by the progressive view of history. Since we now need to find a way to bring socialism without the transition from capitalism, capitalism is no longer a necessary stage towards human liberation. To call for a sustainable development under eco-socialism means a break from productivism, which means also a break from the view of history as progress. With this also comes a break from Eurocentrism, the other essential feature with productivism of the progressive view of history. And so let's read the passage from Saito that explains why the rejection of productivism also means the rejection of Eurocentrism and the progressive view of history as a whole. So first, let's review. According to a Marxist interpretation of the progressive view of history, the primary force driving human history forward is the development of productivity. Therefore, every nation is required to raise its productivity by following the path laid out by Western Europe, capitalistic industrialization. This view of history as progress is based on productivism insofar as it sees increasing productivity as the driving force of history itself. Moreover, this productivism becomes the justification for Eurocentrism. However, once productivism is rejected, a high productivity rate no longer serves as proof that a society has reached a more advanced stage. Progress in terms of technological development that ends up only being destructive loses its meaning as progress. This is why after Marx made his clean break with productivism, he found himself forced to reevaluate the Eurocentrism that forms the other side of that coin. Once he rejected both productivism and Eurocentrism, Marx had no choice but to question the progressive view of history itself. And this amounts to nothing less than a complete rethinking of historical materialism. So the argument is quite simple. The progressive view of history relies on two ideas, productivism and Eurocentrism. Productivism in relation to history states that primary force driving human history forward is the development of productivity. Becoming more productive doesn't just imply that history is moving, changing, but evolving for the better. That's why it is progressive. It moves towards progress, becoming better than what it was in previous stages. Therefore, a society whose productivity is higher than another will be seen as better, more involved, more civilized than the other. Since in this view, Europe happens to be the most advanced in terms of productivity, Europe becomes the model to emulate for non-European societies. And so this is Eurocentrism. And clearly, it finds its justification in productivism. But if we reject productivism, this entails that progress doesn't depend on levels of productivity, and therefore whomever achieves high levels of productivity can no longer claim to be a model for others, and therefore Eurocentrism falls. By exposing the flaws in productivism in relation to the environment, Europe loses its privilege of calling itself progressive relatively to non-European or pre-capitalist nations. If your progress means destruction of natural resources and human lives, then it has no meaning. And as such, progress cannot be defined by technological development. So Marx can no longer claim that history is moving towards its perfection, its most progressive form. He can't even argue that capitalism is a necessary stage, even if he wants to say that it's necessary to understand what we must not do to get communism. So Marx's view that we can and have to get to communism without relying on capitalism means that capitalism has no place in a rational progressive course of history, since all that lies ahead is complete destruction. In short, the progressive view of history is wrong since its two main features were proven wrong. Since productivism and Eurocentrism are wrong, then the progressive view of history is also wrong. But we need to dwell a little bit more on Eurocentrism, because if we took our time dealing with productivism, Eurocentrism didn't get much of a critique here. But in reality, it must receive an even harsher criticism for the colonialism, imperialism, and racism that it justified. This can sound shocking because we know that Marx is one of the loudest voices against imperialism and colonialism. We know that Marx quickly took the side of the oppressed with regard to the anti-colonial struggles in India and in Ireland against British colonial rule, the January uprising in Poland, Algeria against the French, and sided with the North and black emancipation in the American Civil War. So this anti-colonial position was relevant, it was prevalent in Marx since the early 1850s. At footnote 83, Saito mentions an article by Sunitika Marghosh, an Indian Marxist-Leninist revolutionary who died in 2014, but wrote an article in 1984 tracing Marx's anti-colonial thought's evolution since the 50s until his death. So the article is called Marx on India. It's an article that we will come back to, but for now the main idea is that Marx was anti-colonialist. And this may lead someone to assume that if you are anti-colonialist, then you cannot be Eurocentric, right? Well, this is where you're wrong, because being anti-colonialism doesn't mean that you are not Eurocentric. This was Marx's case. He opposed colonialism, but at the same time, his Eurocentrism can still have him develop sympathies for colonialism. If there is indeed traces of Eurocentrism in Marx, then it can twist Marx's doctrines and make them another attempt at what Saito calls the willful project of European history onto the rest of the world. If this were the whole story, this would mean that Marxism could, even in the worst-case scenario, be used to justify colonialism as a way to bring civilization and modernization to primitive peoples. It is for this dangerous Eurocentrism that Marxist thought has been repeatedly criticized. Like we said, Eurocentrism claims that everyone should follow Europe's model because Europe is the most advanced continent of all, the most civilized. And as such, someone can use this as a way to justify colonialism by saying Europe must bring primitive peoples to civilization and modernization. It would be okay for Europe to colonize Africa, Asia, and America because it will bring them technological progress. True, at the beginning that technology will be used for oppression, to oppress and exploit the shit out of people there, but those primitive people can never know true freedom and live to their full human potential without the technological progress that Europe already achieved. So we can say that for a while some bad shit will happen, but that will also prepare the primitive people for a revolution. They will eventually develop a rational view of the world and seize this technology that colonialism brought, and so they can usher their socialist regimes, right? Colonialism would then be a lesser evil in this scenario. So, like capitalism was viewed as a necessary step towards real progress, towards communism, that capitalism is needed because only it can set the proper conditions for communism, the same logic can be applied to colonialism. It is a necessary step for the liberation of primitive people. Such a way of thinking is, well, rightly criticized. I mean, the question is, does Marx really have that element of Eurocentrism in his thought? And according to Saito, well, yeah, he had it. In the 1850s, at least, it is very explicit, and Saito even says that this tendency kept going until the first volume of Das Kapital, so until 1867. To support this, he quotes from the preface of the first edition of Volume 1. He quotes a sentence that, according to him, is undeniably Eurocentric, and it's a sentence that expresses perfectly the progressive view of history. He says, the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. Now, that quote is from the first edition of Volume 1. But I think that Saito may be wrong here, at least with this particular sentence from the first edition, because when you read the whole passage, it's actually more nuanced and it can be interpreted differently. Here, Saito interprets it as an instance of the white man's burden. It's a phrase popularized by the British poet Rudyard Kipling in his 1899 poem of the same name. So the poem was written in the context of the US colonization of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and it urged the United States to take up the role of an imperial power. Like white Europeans and Americans have a moral obligation or duty to civilize, govern, and uplift non-European peoples, often in colonialized regions. So the burden is the supposed responsibility to bring Western culture, religion, governance, and economic systems to other peoples who were often portrayed as savage or childlike. So Saito interprets that sentence in a similar fashion, a European country telling a non-European country, this is what progress looks like. Or at least he says that it can be interpreted as such, but in the preface, the two countries that Marx refers to are actually two capitalist developed European countries. They are England and Germany. You see, Marx wrote Das Kapital in German, but he was living in England. And the point of the book is, in Marx's own words in that preface, just one paragraph before the quoted sentence, is to examine the capitalist mode of production. living in England, he examined capitalism as it was in England, which is the locus classicus of any study of capitalism. Locus classicus means the reference. Anyone who wants to understand how capitalism operates should study it in England, in London specifically, because that's where at that time capitalism got to its most advanced stage. And so he is telling actually his German readers, he's not using that, for non-European countries, but he's telling German readers that what he has to say about capitalism in England also concerns them, because England is where they are heading. Germany hasn't gone full capitalist yet, and so Marx is saying, here's what you will be like. This is your future once capitalism takes off. You'll be like England. He says that England is used as the main illustration of the theoretical developments that I make, and so he's not encouraging Germany to follow England's models. On the contrary, what he is presenting in Das Kapital is a very bleak illustration of capitalism. He literally says to his German readers that if you think you shouldn't pay attention to what capitalism looks like in England because it isn't that bad in Germany, like the conditions of German workers and farmers aren't as bad as English workers and farmers, well, you are making a big mistake. So Marx is actually warning his German readers that what is happening right now in England will also happen in Germany, because the conditions he is describing in Das Kapital aren't contingent to capitalism but are bound to happen, like any natural phenomena is bound to happen according to natural laws. So that sentence is actually a warning, not really a celebration. So it is very far from anything like, the white man's burden. And it's not a progressive view of history, since Marx only says most developed industrially, which doesn't have any normative content. He doesn't say that this is better. He doesn't say that this is progress in the sense that it is loaded with a positive connotation. And lastly, it's about two European countries, both already striving to further industrial development. So I really don't see how that can be used as an example of Eurocentrism or a progressive view of history, but Saito is still right in calling Marx a Eurocentric, because there are other passages in at least some drafts of Das Kapital that are clearly Eurocentric. And he'll quote one that cannot be misinterpreted as, as anything else, So I just don't think that the sentence from the preface that he chose here corresponds to that, but he's still right about Marx being a Eurocentric. And of course he's absolutely right if you are talking about the Marx of the 40s and the 50s, because there is a scholar that is a specialist in Eurocentrism. It is one of the most brilliant critiques of Eurocentrism, of the progressive view of history, of colonialism, and of orientalism, and he exposed these tendencies in the early Marx, and I'm talking about Edward Said. So I don't think that there is any need to introduce who Edward Said is. He's the Palestinian-American post-colonial scholar who wrote the very influential work Orientalism in 1978. So Orientalism is a term that refers to the way social societies have historically perceived, represented, and dominated the cultures of the Middle East, of North Africa, and Asia, collectively called the Orient. So in the introduction, Said defines Orientalism as a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident, so the East and the West. It starts with making an other and forges an identity against this other. So this is the starting point of all theories, epics, novels, political accounts concerning the Orient, its people, its customs, its destiny, its mind, etc., by Western writers, by Western poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, imperial administrators, etc. Like, the West constructs an image of the East as exotic, backward, irrational, dangerous, or inferior, and often in need of Western control, discipline, or civilization. And in that book, Saito also he also portrays Marx as an Orientalist too, someone that portrays the East in the ways just mentioned. So the book even has an epigraph from Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So the famous phrase is, "They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented." So this is the main idea. The Orient, being backward and uncivilized, requires that someone else speaks for them. Now, in Marx's text, that sentence, like again, this is like Saito. This is a very bad choice to. Just like Saito, I think he should have chosen another quote from Marx, because the sentence, "They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented," that sentence in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte is about farmers and peasants who, because they are isolated from one another due to a lack of communication means, and because they live in poverty, they cannot organize and form a social class to put forth their interests through a parliament or a convention. So they need representatives who can do that for them. Said takes that sentence and says that the West has erected itself as the representative of the East, in the sense that the West decides on how the East must be represented, because the East cannot represent themselves anyways. They are too primitive and uncivilized for that. John Stuart Mill, for example, which Said mentions alongside Marx, said something quite similar about India. Mill is remembered for his rejection of paternalism and for his advocacy of negative liberty and gender equality. So it was odd that in his works on liberty and representative government, he'd say that this political model of freedom only applies to Europe, not in India, because Indians were too racially and civilizationally inferior for this type of freedom. Mill also worked as an Indian official during England's colonial control of India. So we're going to talk about India, because according to Said, this kind of paradox or double standard is also found in Marx. Okay, it's not just Mill, it's also Marx. His criticism of Marx is found in the third section of the second chapter. There are only 3 chapters in Orientalism, but they are quite long. And so we should call them parts rather than chapters, and the sections call them chapters. But anyway, so in section Oriental Residence and Scholarship, from the chapter Orientalist Structures and Restructures, you have Said's main criticism of Marx's Orientalism, and Saito quotes from that section. So he says, in article after article, he returned with increasing conviction to the idea that even in destroying Asia, Britain was making possible there a real social revolution. Marx's humanity, his sympathy for the misery of people are clearly engaged. Yet, in the end, it is a romantic Orientalist vision that wins out. Thus, Said concludes that ultimately Marx's economic analyses are perfectly fitted to a standard Orientalist undertaking. So the criticism is clear, and it is very much the same kind of criticism we can give John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill too thought that Indians cannot govern themselves, but with colonization they will become able to, and so once they achieve true enlightenment, when they become rational like white Europeans, the Europeans will pack up and go. In the end, colonization can be a good thing. It may have caused a little bit of oppression and persecution, just a little bit, like in Nazi Germany. There may have been, a little bit of persecution, but in the end, India is getting something out of it. So you can still hear these kind of arguments from right-wing people nowadays, and even from some people from the left when it comes to Zionism, for example. I remember once Dennis Prager of that conservative Zionist propaganda joke that is Prager University, trying to rehabilitate colonialism. He said that when England colonized India, for example, it forced India to abandon some barbaric practices like sati, where a widow after her husband's death must immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre. And this may sound horrible, and it is, but narratives like Prager's make it sound like this practice was standardized or widespread in India, or was applied without any resistance or any skepticism. And this is completely wrong. It was applied only in some closed upper-class circles, and you had many oppositions and condemnations of the practice as a perversion of Hinduism by Indians, by Hindus, by Buddhists and Muslims alike, before the British colonial rule officially banned the practice in 1829. So, like all narratives that are sympathetic to colonialism, they are usually highly exaggerated and inaccurate. To go back to Ghosh's article now, Marx on India, Ghosh says that when Marx spoke about India in its pre-colonial period, his depiction depended on the reports of some high British officials. And as you can guess, it was far from accurate. Ghosh identified 7 inaccurate characteristics on India in Marx, and of course we're not going to see them here, but that Marx has the charge of perpetuating an inaccurate discourse on India, which of course is going to help justifying colonialism. And when you consider it from a consequentialist perspective, the period of colonial violence that India knew back then overshadows easily all the cases of sati in all of India's history and all the instances of backwardness identified by British officials. If you thought sati was bad, well, just see the violence inflicted on Indians by the civilized British authorities. So Saito is right in saying that we cannot follow Mill and Marx and others who try to see a good side to colonialism, and even asserts in the conclusion that because there are many people in the Orient who use Marx as a theorist to fight off colonial power and to liberate their society from antagonism, this modern Orient in reality participates in its own Orientalization. Now, back to Said's criticism. In the full passage that Saito quotes, like he doesn't quote the full passage because the full passage from Said is quite long, it goes on for like 3 pages. So Saito just quotes parts of Said's criticism. Said actually says something very interesting. He says that Marx pushes us to reconcile 2 things that shouldn't be reconciled. That there is our natural repugnance as fellow creatures to the sufferings of Orientals, people from the Orient, while their society is being violently transformed on the one hand, and the historical necessity of these transformations on the other. Like, Marx recognizes that, for example, India had an economic system before British rule, and that the introduction of British economics into the Indian system led to great depravity, violence, and suffering. Now, normally, we should be opposed to this completely, but then Marx says that these transformations, although unbearable at first sight, should be embraced because they are setting the proper conditions for a socialist revolution. And thereby, they're all part of history's necessary progress. But according to Saito, this simply reduces the Orient as an element for a romantic Western redemption. It's like saying, yes, I'm exploiting and oppressing you to your bones right now, but I will make it up to you. It's a way for the West to clear its conscience, to redeem itself. So this only way, the only way to reject capitalism and colonialism is to claim that they are necessary because it is their internal contradictions that will weaken it and cause the revolution and liberation of the same people it exploits and oppresses in the first place. So Said says two main things. The first thing is that Marx's moral equation of Asiatic loss with the British colonial rule that he condemned gets skewed. It gets skewed back towards the old inequality between the East and the West. Like Marx did morally equate the loss, the destruction of the traditional Asiatic society with the harm of British colonialism, like both were negative. However, Marx also implied that the destruction might have a progressive side in historical terms. So even though Marx condemned colonialism, his framework still placed the West as the historical agent of progress and the East as the passive recipient of change. And so this produces the same imbalance found in Orientalism, Orientalist thought. The West is dynamic, active, and it is history making, and the East is static, passive, and in need of being awakened. So in other words, Marx slips back into the old inequality that Orientalism fosters, an assumption of Western superiority and Eastern backwardness. So even while opposing empire, Marx's framework still casts the East in a subordinate, stagnant role compared to the West. And the second thing now is about his human sympathy, Marx's human sympathy, that he obviously suppresses in favor of colonialism and Orientalist vision. Said asks, why did that sympathy go away? And his answer is because, well, Orientalism doesn't consider individuals, but always abstract general groups. It conceives humanity either in large collective terms or in abstract generalities. And the consequence is that you take those humans as homogeneous. It's like the example of sati. You take that all Indians, regardless of their particularities, they must all somehow be in favor of sati or don't dare question it or oppose it. Said says Marx was no exception to this. He too fell into this abstract thinking, ironic for a guy who claims to think dialectically and concretely. And so the collective Orient was easier for him to use in illustration of a theory that existential human identities. Now, Said supports this with the thesis that your language structures your thought. If Marx, who was initially truly sympathetic to Indian suffering and to considering the particularities of each Indian identity, because his European theoretical language is more oriented towards expressing abstractions, he became to think of Indians as abstractions too. So what censored his humanity was the very vocabulary he found himself forced to employ. So what that censor did, Said says, was to stop that sympathy and then chase it away. Instead, we have a new definition of Orientals supported by Western racist science. They are people who don't suffer, who don't experience pain like Westerners do, so they don't have to be treated in the same way. Here we can also add a similar criticism from another scholar mentioned in Ghosh's article. This one is a Zionist piece of shit, an Israeli political scientist who died in 2023, so good riddance, Shmolo Avineri, which is fun to say that he and Said share the same criticism about Marx, because it's so ironic, and an Israeli blaming someone for justifying colonialism. So Avineri's criticism can be further consequence of Said's. Also, I found it weird that Ghosh never mentioned Said in his article, because Orientalism came out in 6 or 7 years before Ghosh's article, so he must have been aware of it. But anyway, so among critiques of Marx's sympathies towards colonialism, Ghosh mentions Avineri. So Avineri says that as we follow Marx's views on India and colonialism, we have to ascribe to him a following view. Since he asserts that Marx thinks that just as the horrors of industrialization are dialectically necessary for the triumph of communism, so the horrors of colonialism are dialectically necessary for the world revolution of the proletariat, since without those horrors, the countries of Asia, and presumably also Africa, will not be able to emancipate themselves from their stagnant backwardness. In other words, since colonialism can only be overthrown by a proletarian revolution, and that we are in a progressive view of history, the conclusion will be that in order for the colonialized nations to get their independence, there has to be first a proletarian revolution in the colonizing nations first. Get it? India must wait for the proletariat in Europe to revolt, and then the Indians can follow. There is no possibility for national wars of liberation prior to the proletarian revolution in Europe. We first liberate the proletariat, then we liberate the colonized. Marx, according to this interpretation, believes that only the proletariat can carry a revolution and usher a socialist society. But the only way to have a proletariat is through capitalism. And the only way Oriental societies can have capitalism is through colonialism. So colonialism is necessary. Now you may say, why would, the pre-colonial Oriental societies need socialism in the first place? Well, Marx would say that's because they are backward. They have Oriental despotism. They have superstition. They don't live to their full potential, etc. So, of course, the logical course would be that the countries who already have a proletariat must be the first one to liberate themselves. No national liberation for you until the proletariat in Europe is free. So this is like the incrementalist view that says that the interests of some groups are more prioritized than others. First we emancipate white women from the patriarchy, and then we'll see about the black women still in slavery. And so another consequence from this is, according to Avineri, is something similar to what Said said about sympathy. Said argued that Marx has little sympathy for the Indians under British rule, while Avineri says that Marx would have no sympathy with for national movements in India. He affirms that he had none for the Great Indian Revolt of 1857 and 58, and with those who took part in it. Now we have to ask, is this criticism true? Did Marx really think and said these things in Said and Avineri's criticism? Well, yes, he did, because Said quotes from Marx. Both Said and Avineri quote two articles from Marx he wrote on India in 1853 for the New York Tribune, back when he was 35 years old, as the main source for this, for Marx's support for colonialism. So the first article is called "The British Rule in India," and yes, when you read that article, the Eurocentrism and Orientalism of Marx is obvious. Saito quotes from that article. This is Marx writing: England, it is true, is causing a social revolution in Hindustan, that's India, in causing a social revolution in India, was actuated only by the vilest interests, and was stupid in her manner of enforcing them. But that is not the question. The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? If not, whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. See, like, we have a recognition of the suffering perpetuated by England on Indians, but right away that sympathy is tucked under the rug. It is dismissed as not the thing that we should focus on. We should focus on the suffering and colonial violence, but we shouldn't, focus on the suffering and colonial violence, but on the question whether that violence will bring about a socialist revolution in India. And this is the passage that Saito picked, but he could have picked any other passage from Marx's article. He could have chosen the one Said picked in his criticism, like Said quotes that same passage, but he also quotes others from the same one, where Marx, for example, says that it is sickening to human feeling to witness those industrious, patriarchal, and inoffensive social organizations of Indian society, disorganized and dissolved, thrown into a sea of woes, and their individual members losing their ancient form of civilization and their hereditary means of subsistence. But then he adds that it's not that bad because these idyllic village communities that may appear inoffensive, but they've always been the solid foundation of Oriental despotism. They restrained the human mind with superstition and enslavement to tradition, depriving it of all grandeur and historical energies, whatever the fuck that means. So it's all good because, yeah, we are destroying their way of life and subjugate them to the most horrendous life condition, but at least we are liberating them from superstition and from their form of despotism. Or what about, another more explicit passage, like the one where he literally says, and I'm quoting Marx here, England has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of Asiatic society and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia. So this quote isn't from the article we just mentioned, but from a second one also published in the New York Tribune in the same year on India, called The Future Results of British Rule in India. So reading something like this, one even starts to think, well, was the socialist revolution in India even meant to be carried by the Indians or the British settlers at this point? This sounds like a Zionist project at this point, right? Like Marx has gone full consequentialist here, and the bad kind, the bad kind of consequentialism. Even finishing the first article on India with a quote from a Goethe's poem where he literally says that it's okay to suffer this much if at the end the pleasure will be greater. Like the poem is, it ends with this poem, with the final lines of the poem by Goethe. So it's should this torture then torment us, since it brings us greater pleasure? We're not through the rule of Timur, souls devoured without measures. So that's the poem from Goethe. Should we consider torture, since in the end it will bring us an ever greater pleasure? And Timur, for those who don't know who that is, he was the Turco-Mongol conqueror who founded the Timurid Empire in Central Asia and Persia in the 14th century. He is historically known for his military genius, but also for the extreme brutality of his campaigns, massacres, destruction, and the piling of skulls in conquered cities. So, yeah, he was devouring souls without measure, but at the same time, he was a great patron of the arts. He often interacted with great intellectuals such as Ibn Khaldun, the historian and perhaps the first sociologist in history, and Hafiz, the Persian poet that Goethe loved reading and was a huge influence on him. So here, Goethe is saying that although it is sad that Timur was ruthless, he was a ruthless psychopath, under his rule we had a renaissance before the European Renaissance, so it was worth it. You cannot make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. So to quote Saito, Marx, of course, acknowledged the cruel nature of British colonial rule in India, but he also appeared to justify it by evoking its eventual effect on the progress of human history. At the same time, Marx saw Asian society, with India as the prime example, as stagnant, passive, and possessing no history at all. It therefore took the incursion of a capitalist nation like Britain to drive history from the outside. As Saito points out, this displays all the characteristics of an Orientalist point of view. Marx is justifying the suffering Marx is justifying the suffering produced by history's advancement, calling it a necessary evil for the progress of human history as a whole. As an Asian Marxist, I must say that such a Eurocentric view is utterly unacceptable. Yeah, so the comment on Asia having no history at all needs to be explained, because there too we can have misunderstanding. It is Eurocentric and all, but not for the reasons most people think when they are told that Marx said that India or any other non-European nation has no history. So that sentence comes from the second article on India under British rule and serves as the answer to the question that begins the article: why English supremacy managed to establish itself in India. So Marx had an answer, and that's because India has no history. That's why it was dominated by British colonial power. Now, what does he mean? Well, what he means by no history is no known history. Like, if you read the whole sentence, that's what he says. Indian society has no history at all, or at least no known history. And so this statement does not mean that India literally has no past or no records of past events. Rather, Marx is making a Hegelian argument, drawing from the from the philosophy of Hegel, who claimed that true history only begins with self-conscious political development, especially in the form of rational progressive institutions. That's where history, in its Hegelian philosophical meaning, starts. It's not just a linear record of events that happen on a certain territory, but a progressive political self-conscious continuation. When a nation becomes conscious of itself as a nation and sees itself unfold, evolve, change over time in a progressive manner. So that is history for Hegel. So here, what Marx is saying is that India has no history, it is just not known history, self-conscious history. It just has a record of series of events, a series of invasions, of dynasties, of rulers and ruled, but it doesn't have a collective consciousness striving towards its political peak. And according to Marx, the fact that Indian society is deeply divided plays a part in this due to its constant external conquests. Like he says, what is recorded as India's history is not the internal evolution of its society, but merely a sequence of external conquests: Turks, Persians, Mongols, Afghans, and now British, each breaking the rule established by the former. And so this makes India incapable of developing internally, because its identity keeps getting shackled in its foundation, and thus it remains static and unchanged, locked in, in the caste division, in tribalism, and develops no class struggle as Marx understood class struggle. So everyone just remains content with the status quo, and that's one of the 7 characteristics that Marx makes of India, identified in Ghosh's article. Thus, there is no true progressive evolution of Indian society, and therefore there is no history. In other words, India as a collective subject has no agency or internal dialectical motion that would amount to history in the Western progressive enlightened sense. But yeah, it is still Eurocentric and very Orientalist, and it is based on a philosophical notion of history that no one is obliged to accept. Why should history be this self-conscious political progress? Plus, we've seen that it compels its proponents into having to accept any bullshit that happens during their progressive history as somehow necessary and for the better. And lastly, Saito mentions another passage that highlights Marx's Eurocentrism, and it's the passage that we overshadowed earlier, the one from an early draft of Das Kapital. So this one didn't make its way into the published version of the first volume, but clearly it is Eurocentric. It's part of Marx's critique of the Swiss socialist economist Jean-Charles Léonard Simond de Sismondi. So yeah, that's his whole name, but we just call him Sismondi. So in Das Kapital, you have many passages criticizing Sismondi's idea, but here you have that one passage that involves Eurocentrism, which is only found in an early draft of First Capital. So, quote, "To oppose the welfare of the individual to this end, as Sismondi does, is to assert that the development of the species must be arrested in order to safeguard the welfare of the individual, so that, for instance, no war may be waged in which at all events some individuals perish. Sismondi is only right as against the economists who conceal or deny this contradiction. Apart from the barrenness of such edifying reflections, they reveal a failure to understand the fact that although at first the development of the capacities of the human species takes place at the cost of the majority of human individuals and whole human classes, in the end it breaks through this contradiction and coincides with the development of the individual. The higher development of individuality is thus only achieved by a historical process during which individuals are sacrificed." So, let's read that last part again. The higher development of individuality is only achieved by a historical process during which individuals are sacrificed. You got that? You need to sacrifice individuals to the historical process for the higher development of the individual. So Marx here is arguing explicitly that we can disregard individual welfare because if we cannot transgress it every time it shows up, already from the perspective of the human species, that would be a catastrophe. The evolution of the species would stop if we had to care about individual welfare whenever it pops up. We wouldn't be able to wage wars since it's going to cost us some individual lives. So what Marx is saying here is that it is true that historical processes and individual welfare are opposed. He doesn't deny the contradiction. It's in that regards that he agrees with Sismondi and acclaims him when economists deny this contradiction or pretend that it doesn't exist. But whereas Sismondi sees this contradiction as a reason to be skeptical of progress and historical processes, in the end, Marx sides with those who ignore this contradiction in favor of the historical process, saying that at the end, even if we are going to overlook human welfare for a moment, in the end the contradiction will be overcome and progress will coincide with individual welfare. So Sismondi was like Marx, highly critical of capitalism, and indeed Marx is indebted to Sismondi. He doesn't just criticize him in Das Kapital, he actually borrows from him a lot to build his critique of capitalism. So Sismondi was disturbed by the social consequences of industrial capitalism, such as crises, inequalities, and overproduction. However, Marx sees Sismondi as ultimately reactionary because although he criticized capitalism, he longed for a return to pre-capitalist forms like small-scale production and the patriarchal relations, rather than grasping capitalism as a historical phase with its own internal laws and contradictions. So instead of uncovering the inner laws of capitalist development, as Marx seeks to do, Sismondi criticized its consequences from a moral standpoint and based his analysis on the symptoms, like crises, without understanding the causes. So rather than seeing crises as structural contradictions arising from surplus value production and the accumulation process, Sismondi perceives them as moral or accidental failings of the system. Sismondi's critique is described as pessimistic and romantic. He warns about overproduction, he warns about class conflict, but did not offer a revolutionary or forward-looking analysis. His nostalgia for the past made him incapable of recognizing the progressive aspects of capitalism, like the development of productive forces that Marx, insists must be acknowledged, even if only to understand why capitalism will eventually be overthrown. So, even if that passage wasn't included in Das Kapital, you have in the critique of Sismondi in the first volume clear instances where it is implied that capitalism can only be overcome by its own advantages, and as such its negative consequences cannot be avoided but are also part of its own dismantlement. So in the end, it's a good thing. But to go back to that passage from the manuscript, it is very objectionable. Saito even writes that as one reads it, one cannot help but feel that Marx became a neoliberal in that passage, since Marx is basically asking for the further development of capitalism to bring it down, a view also called as accelerationism. He will also have to promote neoliberal ideas such as promote production even at the expense of the individual, spread market capitalism through the world. Only this can bring about freedom and liberation. It's as if in these passages Marx has become a neoliberal ideologue. Okay, so it's undeniable from his early days until about the first volume of Das Kapital, Marx was still Eurocentric. But what about after 1868? Well, according to Saito, if you look at what Marx produced after Volume 1, the changes of Eurocentrism and Orientalism of Said, the charges of Eurocentrism and Orientalism of Said, they no longer hold. Gauche too says the same thing. Most people who criticize Marx don't seem to be aware of everything that he wrote. Like he says, it is a pity that many writers consider Marx's earlier thesis about the double mission of the British rule in India as his final word on the subject. So as we pointed, Marx immersed himself in the natural sciences with a particular interest in agriculture, and there he began to take interest in how other societies outside the scope of European paradigms did agriculture. By taking interest in non-European and pre-capitalist agricultural practices, this time not from colonial officers, Marx began to question whether capitalism is actually the way towards communism, and thus he no longer takes Europe as the model for all societies to follow towards communism. Now, Marx started considering learning from those societies rather than telling those societies to learn from Europe, even if that meant copying with colonialism. So he read extensively through the work of people like Franz on ancient Rome, indigenous people in America and South America, in Northern Africa, and of course India. And this, according to Saito, made him adopt another discourse, one that is very different from the one Said exposed, even outgrowing his earlier optimism about the revolutionary role of British colonial rule. So, to quote Saito, looking at his research notes from this time, we see Marx not only criticize Britain for its colonialism, but also writing positively about the tenacious resistance displayed by Indian farming communes. So, there, India is no longer a land with no history that needs the help of its oppressor to develop sustainable economies or learn from white settlers. Now it is Marx who ended up learning from them, seeing their practices as perhaps more progressive and more revolutionary than Europe's. He also took a particular interest in agricultural communes in Russia. This even motivated him to learn Russian in order to examine materials on cooperative land management and cultivation, and even enter debates about this issue with Russians, and a particular Russian that we have to talk about. So in February 1881, so 2 years before his death, Marx received a letter from a Russian revolutionary residing in Geneva, written on February 6th, and wrote a response to it on March 8th. So this small exchange revolved around the future of the communes in Russia and their potential for revolutionary movements. So that revolutionary was Vera Zasulich, a Russian woman born in 1849 and known for her role in both early Russian terrorism and later Marxist socialism. So in 1878, she shot and wounded General Fyodor Trepov, the government of Saint Petersburg, to protest his brutal treatment of a revolutionary student who was arrested in 1876 during a student demonstration. And so this guy was named Arkhip Bogolyubov. So Bogolyubov was a member of the Go to the People movement, and this was a populist movement in the Russian Empire inspired by anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin. Basically, people go to the people, mainly the peasantry, and try to radicalize them and convince them to overthrow the Tsar's regime. So revolutionaries who engaged in this were called propagandists. As you can guess, they are not liked by the authorities very much. And so anyways, Bogolyubov gets arrested and sentenced to 15 years of labor. In 1877, he was exercising in a prison yard, and Trepov, the governor general, was visiting the prison, and he sees Bogolyubov wearing his cap, which as sensitive as an authority official can be. He took that personally and he knocked it off his head. And so this triggered a violent protest by prisoners watching from their cells. So Trepov needed to set an example and ordered Bogolyubov to be flogged. It's the act of beating someone with a whip or a rod. And apparently the flogging was so violent that it drove Bogolyubov insane. He died in 1887 in his father's care after years at a mental asylum. And so in retaliation to the flogging, Bogolyubov's old comrades organized a squad of 6 men to kill Trepov. But in January 24th, 1878, Vera Zasulich shot and wounded Trepov before they could get to him. And so her act was widely publicized, turning her into a celebrity and hero among revolutionaries opposed to the Tsarist regime. So the Tsar's government was very unpopular in Russia, so she found a lot of support for her assassination attempt, even getting acquitted by a jury, which shocked the government. And so this was during the reign of Alexander II, which eventually got assassinated on March the 31st, 1881. As for Zasulich, she had to flee the empire and went into hiding in Western Europe, where she became a Marxist and founded in 1883 the first Russian Marxist organization, the Emancipation of Labor Group, with Plekhanov and Axelrod. And so this group laid the foundations of Russian Marxism, turning away from the populist idea of peasant revolution and focusing instead on industrial workers. Then she returned to Russia in 1905 during the Russian Revolution of that year, and then she became a leading figure in the Mensheviks, the moderate wing of Russian social democracy, opposing Lenin's Bolsheviks. So after the 1917 revolution, she was marginalized by the Bolsheviks, and she died in relative obscurity in 1919. But what interests us here is that exchange between Marx in February and March 1881. 1881. So according to Saito, it is this exchange that we can see explicitly. We can see explicitly in this exchange Marx's critique of the progressive view of history and his clean break from Eurocentrism. So Zasulich wrote the letter from Geneva in Poland to ask Marx an important question. See, Russia compared to the European nations, was the least developed industrially and technologically speaking. The population was still overall agrarian, no industrial revolution happened there yet, which means that capitalism didn't take off like it did in Germany, France, or England. Yet the living conditions were horrible, and many, like I said, were very dissatisfied with the Tsarist regime. So many people started to adopt socialist sentiment, but that didn't take the form of Marxism, though Marx's Das Kapital, as Zasulich says in her letter, was popular in Russia, and many are reading it with great attention. Though they're reading the few copies left in circulation since it was confiscated and banned by the authorities. Instead, the dominant socialist tendency in Russia was something called Narodny Shestvo. So, Narodny Shestvo means populism, and is the kind of ideology embraced by Bogolyubov and what we call the Narodniks. One of their most influential figures is Nikolai Chernikovsky, a reader and admirer of Das Kapital, by the way, and he's known for his novel What Is to Be Done in 1863, which became a revolutionary Bible for a generation of Russian radicals. So the plot follows Vera Pavlovna, a young woman who liberates herself from patriarchal and economic oppression by fleeing her family and setting up a sewing cooperative run democratically by working women, a model of self-managed socialist production. So it explores many themes like free love, self-sacrifice, rational ethics among revolutionary individuals, and utopianism. And so the novel contains 4 dreams or visions where Vera imagines the future socialist society like rational, egalitarian, cooperative, and free of coercion. And it had great influence on Emma Goldman, for example, who took Pavlovna as a role model for her, and Lenin even wrote an essay called "What Is to Be Done" as a homage to Chernyshevsky, though also very different in terms of content and strategy. So they're actually opposed to one another in terms of their socialist strategies and vision. I mean, Lenin's "What Is to Be Done" and Chernyshevsky's "What Is to Be Done." So anyways, you also had anarchism as socialist tendency in Russia. At that time, it was perhaps a little bit more popular than Marxism, but it was way less popular than populism. So it had similarities like the hostility towards the state and authority, but populism was the dominant tendency. So what does populism advocate? Well, it is rooted in the belief that the Russian peasantry, not the industrial proletariat, could be the basis for socialism. Marxism was still very marginalized in Russia, since there was no industrial revolution, no proletariat, and capitalism was still in its very primitive stage. Russia still had agricultural communes called mirs, and the Narodniks argued for a socialist revolution led by a revolutionary peasantry rather than the proletariat that would, topple imperial domination and expanding these communes, ushering socialism without having to go through capitalism. So in her letter, Zasulich asks Marx if it is possible to get communism without going through capitalism, and she frames it like it's a life or death question. As I said, the conditions in the Russian Empire were extremely harsh. Serfdom was only abolished in 1861, but emancipation was poorly implemented. Former serfs were granted inadequate land and forced to pay redemption payments for decades. Many remained tied to the land under communal structures, those mirs, and were burdened with debts and taxes, low literacy, primitive healthcare, and high infant mortality were widespread. Also, if you were a minority, you wouldn't want to live in that empire. Like the Russian Empire was an autocracy, meaning no constitution, no parliament, no civil liberties. and so censorship, surveillance, and exile, like for example exile to Serbia, were common punishments for dissidents. So revolutionary movements were met with brutal repression, like mass arrests and executions, etc. And if you are a religious or ethnic minority, it's even worse. The empire encompassed dozens of nationalities and religions, but Russification policies forced many minorities to adopt Russian language and culture. Poles, Ukrainians, Tatars, and Baltic peoples were faced with cultural repression. Jews in particular faced severe restrictions, confined to the Pale of Settlement, which is a large territory in the western part of the Russian Empire, where Jews were legally allowed to live. Outside this area, Jews were generally forbidden to reside permanently unless they received special permission. They were also often victims of pogroms, state-condoned violent attacks, so it wasn't that great. Plus, in the late 1880s and 1890s, industrialization began accelerating. Not yet an industrial revolution, but it is starting. This, however, was creating a new class of urban proletariat where working conditions were pretty brutal. Like long hours, you had 12 to 15 hours per day, low pay, child labor, unsafe environments, no rights to organize unions or strike legally, and workers lived in overcrowded slums, often in unsanitary barracks. So given how bad things are, Zasulich is telling Marx that we are faced with two choices in Russia. It's either the rural commune, freed of exorbitant tax demands, payment to the nobility, and arbitrary administration. So it's either the rural commune becomes capable of developing becomes capable to develop in a socialist direction that is gradually organizing its production and distribution on a collective basis, or we wait many decades for the Russian peasants' land to turn into the hands of the bourgeoisie, and then wait for centuries for capitalism in Russia to reach similar levels of development already attained in Western Europe, while workers continually keep drowning in the peasant mass, which, following the dissolution of the commune, will come to towns in search for a wage. So, if Marx's progressive view of history is correct, then the commune cannot be a revolutionary force. Peasants will be the same French peasants that Marx described in his 18th Brumaire of Napoleon. They cannot represent themselves. So if we follow Marx, the commune has to dissolve. It's archaic and has no revolutionary potential. It is condemned to perish by history, by scientific socialism. And so Zasulich tells Marx that all Marxists keep telling her the same story, that they have to wait for capitalism to take hold in Russia to be able to switch to communism. So even if she says that Marx never talked about Russia, that Russia has a different history, different conditions than other countries, like you cannot derive anything from anything about Russia from Das Kapital, she's met with responses like Marx would have said as much if he had discussed Russia. So again, we have a uniform vision of history. History is everywhere the same. There is only one possible trajectory for it. This is the progressive view of history. It doesn't only assert that it is necessarily progressive, but that there is only one way towards that progress. But Zasulich's point is that we cannot afford to wait, given the suffering the Russian peasantry is facing, especially when you tell her that it's about to get way worse under capitalism before it starts to get better. Like things are already bad in Russia, or things are already bad in Africa, but colonialism needs to make things way worse before making you able to do the revolution. And so the same thing in Russia. In Russia, things are already bad, but capitalism needs to make things way worse before you can start laughing. And so, as Saito says, the problem here was the line from Capital's first volume, quoting earlier. Let's look at it again. The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. The crux of the debate was whether this quote applied to Russia, that is, did Russia, as the sentence implies, have to modernize itself under capitalism before achieving a socialist revolution. Zasulich decided to ask Marx what he thought. So, I've already explained that this is a misinterpretation of that sentence, but its meaning holds. Must Russia take England as the image of its own future if it wants to become a socialist nation? Or can it not follow the same path and get its socialist revolution without the step of capitalism? So Marx took this challenge very seriously, and he wrote 4 drafts of a response to the letter, which you can, by the way, find in Marxist.org. The fact that he required 4 drafts, with the first being the longest, about 5 to 6 pages, means that Zasulich cut right to the heart of the problem for Marx. We have a non-Westerner. We can debate on whether Russians are Westerners or not, but anyway, so a non-Westerner asking Marx if the Eurocentric view of history as progress in volume 1 of Capital was actually correct. And Marx says no. He clearly says no. He actually provides many arguments for why the progressive view of history is false throughout the drafts and his actual letter, but Saito summarizes them as follows. In his reply, Marx clearly states that the historical analysis in Capital is confined to Western Europe. There is no need to destroy the agricultural communes left in Russia to spur modernization. In fact, in the case of Russia, these communes play an important role in resisting the force of capitalism as it seeks to swallow up the whole world. There is a chance, Marx writes, for Russia to attain communism by developing these communes in their current state, while repeating the positive effects of capitalism as it evolved in the West. This important thing here is Marx's clear articulation that Russia could transition to communism without passing through the Kōhei forks of a capitalist stage of development. It is clear here that late in his life, Marx made a clean break from Eurocentrism and the simplistic view of history that comes with it. So without passing through Kōhei forks means a humiliating and inescapable defeat, especially one in which the loser is forced to submit in a visibly degrading way. It comes from the Battle of Kōhei Forks, 321 BC, during the Second Samnite War between Rome and the Samnites. It's an Italic tribe. So a Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass called the Kōhei Forks, and it was near modern Benevento, so in Italy. And so, unable to fight or to escape, the Romans were forced to surrender without even a battle. And so Marx uses that expression in his third argument from the first draft. He says that you don't have to go through the harsh tribute of capitalism to get to communism. So Russia doesn't have to abandon its commune or follow the same path as the other European countries. He insists that what he said in Das Kapital only applies to Western countries that are already way too deep in capitalism. And so he's not talking about non-Western countries or non-capitalist countries. He even says in the second draft that he doesn't know any Marxist from Russia who may say that Marx argued that the communes are archaic and need to be dismantled. If anything, he warns that his theories are often misunderstood, and the only Russians he knows personally or interacted with his work are Russians who are opposed to him. So in reality, he says in the fourth draft, the commune is the natural starting point, the fulcrum for the regeneration of Russian society. So clearly it has a revolutionary potential. It doesn't mean that it will be easy. Like he says, the harmful influences assailing it on all sides must first be eliminated, and it must then be assured the conditions for spontaneous development. For that, it can, as he argues in the second argument of the first draft, take only what it needs from the technological advancement of capitalism. Russia, as he says, isn't isolated from the rest of the world. It knows what is happening in its contemporary European neighbors. Given that the communes have a kind of dualism, that they can either give way to capitalism or to communism, it can develop a rational and scientific method inspired by the West without its strings attached. So this dualism means that the commune was not devoid of inner contradictions. For Marx, inner contradictions are the main motive force of change and progress. You can only progress because you are faced with inner contradictions that you need to overcome. That's how you get to communism, by overcoming the inner contradictions of economic systems. While Marx first thought that communism can only be obtained by overcoming the inner contradictions of capitalism specifically, now he considers other kinds of contradictions leading to that path. The commune can evolve towards that, towards a more rational and scientific management. And as he says, the rural commune may even appropriate all of capitalism's positive achievements without undergoing its terrible, frightful vicissitudes. He even asserts that Russia does not live in isolation from the modern world, and nor has it fallen prey, like the East Indies, to a conquering foreign power. Here we have an explicit condemnation of colonialism in all of its forms, and Marx, in the third draft, recognizes that in India, the suppression of communal land ownership was nothing but an act of English vandalism, which drove the indigenous population backward rather than forward. This is an important point by the way, Gauch's article, the recognition by Marx that colonialism has no positive aspects whatsoever and contributes to social decline instead of potential revolutionary progress. Gauch mentions another letter to Marx, by Marx to Nikolai Danielson, another Russian revolutionary, and Narodnik, who translated Das Kapital to Russian, the 3 volumes, and maintained a correspondence with Marx since the early 1870s till Marx's passing. So this letter of February 19th, 1881, so the same period as Zasulich's letter, Marx says what the English take annually from Indians in the form of rent, in the form of dividends for railways, useless to Indians, by the way, from pensions for military and civil servicemen, for Afghanistan's and other wars, they amount to no more than the total sum of income of the 60 millions of agricultural and industrial laborers of India. So this Marx as is taking from Indians without any equivalent. They are taking these resources freely and doesn't even include what the English appropriate to themselves annually within India. Here Marx speaks only of the value of the commodities that the Indians have gratuitously and annually sent over to England, what they have to send to England every year. Like Indians have actually nothing left. Everything that they produce is shipped to England, and Marx qualifies this as a bleeding process with a vengeance. What he's saying is that Indians are gaining nothing in return. Their resources are being plundered, their infrastructure is destroyed, their ways of life annihilated, and their bodies mutilated without any signs of the slightest progress that this process promised them. As a matter of fact, he writes in another letter to Danielson, this one from April 10th, 1879, It's about the railways constructed in India by the British. They're not for the Indians, but just for the circulation of capital. He writes that while the railways gave an immense impulse to the development of foreign commerce, but the commerce in countries which export principally raw produce increased the misery of the masses. So anyways, we can go on and on inspecting every argument he gives in his drafts and letter to Zasulich. They all lead to the same conclusion. The progressive view of history is wrong and Europe isn't a model for other nations. And by the way, we'll go back to the letter next week. But the point is that letter had such an influence that everyone who is interested in Marx's evolution and evolution in thought must include it. Even Gosh mentions it in his article to criticize Avineri's take on Marx. Before jumping to the last section of this episode, let's finish with Avineri's criticism. We said that he blamed Marx for two things, arguing that no national liberation movement can occur before the proletariat revolution in Europe, and that Marx had no sympathy for the Indian movement against British rule in the late 1850s. Let's see why that's not true, even back in the 1850s. Let's start with that one. Like, yeah, you can blame Marx for being Eurocentric, but not that he didn't support national liberation movements in India, because he and Engels actually did. Like Gosh points in his article, Marx and Engels, they wrote the first Indian War of Independence of 1857, in which they say that the talk about the apathy of the Hindus, the Indians, or even their sympathy with British rule, is all bullshit. Here, actually, they are attacking head-on the stereotypes on Indians perpetuated by British rule. And so, he says that they are completely justified in attempting to expel the foreign conqueror who have so abused their subjects. Marx described the Indian forces fighting to overthrow British rule as the Revolutionary League and gave them their full support. They weren't like saying, it's nice that they rebel, but they still need colonialism to be more rational in their revolutionary strategies or some shit like that. No, they went full on, England needs to step back from India. Marx even lashed out at those who supported the British. He used the term young Scindia, which means English dogman, for the king of Nepal, who was loyal to the British. At one stage during the progress of war, Marx hoped that victory would belong to the Indians. Hell, Gosh even points that even the 1853 articles on India were misunderstood, as Marx never claimed that it is a necessity to first have a proletariat revolution in Europe for national movements to gain legitimacy, but that it was one of the two options. Marx said, according to Gosh, was that either we wait till the ruling classes in Great Britain were supplanted by the industrial proletariat, or till the Indians themselves were strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. So, as Gosh says, Marx never held, as Avineri would have us believe, that national liberation wars were to wait until proletariat revolutions had succeeded in Europe. If that were the case, then why would Marx support the Irish then? Why would Marx and Engels, when the British also colonized Ireland, argue that for Ireland to even be able to develop just industrially, it needs England to leave it alone? In a series of letters between Marx and Engels between 1869 and 1870, Marx wrote that every time Ireland was just about to develop herself industrially, she was smashed down and forced back into a mere agricultural country. If anything, Marx says the only economy Ireland managed to develop thanks to British colonialism is the industry of cotton making. Like he and Engels were convinced that Ireland has been stunted in its development by the English invasion and thrown centuries back. So we're not in the narrative of colonialism will develop the productive forces of the colonized nations, creating a proletariat class, and it will topple the colonialist and capital regime. As a matter of fact, Marx and Engels both said that the more they study the issue, the more they are convinced of the opposite, even contemplating that perhaps it is the reverse that needs to happen, that a national liberation in Ireland will trigger the proletarian revolution in England. Like he wrote that for the English workers, the national emancipation of Ireland is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation, and the English working class will never accomplish anything until it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. So Marx's conclusion came to be that colonialism simply destroys any productive force and revolutionary potential. The less a nation is penetrated by colonial capitalist external power, the higher its chances to develop towards socialism or even capitalism. Ghosh ends his article with a difference between Japan, China, and India, arguing that Japan was able to transform its pre-capitalist economic structure and emancipate itself from its stagnant backwardness and became one of the leading capitalist power in the world because it was never colonized. In China, Ghosh argues, British penetration wasn't as brutal as in India, and it was thanks to this that Mao, among other factors, managed to lead a socialist revolution. If China ended up like India, no revolution would have been possible. I mean, even Russia, even if the Bolsheviks made a communism based on productivism, if they managed to go from a complete agrarian society based on the commune to the USA's rival in terms of industry and technology, but that's also because Russia was never colonized. In India, British penetration and control were most intensive, direct, and long duration. So the result of it is that its economy is still an appendage of the economy of imperialist countries, and its ruling classes play the role of subordinate junior partners of imperialism, and it is one of the poorest countries that wallow in stagnant backwardness to this day. This is Marx's conclusion. The weaker the penetration of an imperialist power into a country of Asia or Africa or Latin America, the less difficult is the transition from the pre-capitalist to the capitalist or to the socialist stage. On the other hand, the greater the penetration and the more direct the control, the more difficult is the transition. So in the end, according to Ghosh, Marx's late writings show that he came to hold three specific anti-colonialist views. First, colonial rule, far from playing a revolutionary role, throws the people of the colony not forward but backward and makes them dependent on the economy of the metropolitan country. The second, the destruction of the old order, which is the prerequisite for a regeneration, can be carried out by internal forces and not by external ones, like the rule of foreign capital. Like Marx thought at first that capitalism will make the Indians destroy their archaic order and move towards emancipation, but then he realized that capitalism tends to preserve the old social structure in a modified, more oppressive form. So he adopted the view that the contradictions of the old order need to be overcome by the peoples themselves. And such destruction or social revolution depends on the people of the colony themselves. And three, for such destruction, without which there can be no construction or regeneration, a colony must first win national independence. Self-government and independence are of primary necessity to a colony or semi-colony for any real progress of its people. Without smashing the colonial shackles, no colony can achieve regeneration. So that's for Ghosh's article and also for Zasulich letter for now. Just like for now, keep in mind, as a reminder of what we said last week, that not only Marx broke from Eurocentrism, but he also put the collective commons at the center of communism. Alright, so before ending this episode, we can also find another explicit break from Eurocentrism in the preface to the second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto of 1882, translated by Zasulich, by the way. 1 year before Marx's passing and 34 years after the first publication of the manifesto, we have this preface. And so Saito quotes the last sentence of the preface. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development. So here, Marx and Engels, they're contemplating the idea that what can trigger a proletarian revolution isn't the contradiction of capitalism, like he usually believed, but it's a Russian revolution based on the commune, on the mir. It's a revolution based on the commons, on the common ownership of land. And so this is huge to have included this insight in this new Russian edition. There was a previous edition of the manifesto in Russia, published in the 1860s, translated by Bakunin, but he didn't add any preface to it. So it didn't include this emphasis on the commune. Now, with this, Marx is acknowledging the role of the commune and of Russia in the revolutionary transition to communism, even contemplating the idea that maybe Russia is closer to socialism than the Western Europe countries. This is an incredible shift in his views. Originally, Marx didn't say anything about Russia in his manifesto. In the 1882 preface, he says that he ignored Russia because not only it didn't have proletarian revolution potential, but it was also actually the last great reserve of all European reaction. The Tsar, as Marx says, was proclaimed the chief of European reaction. So it was anti-revolutionary to the core, with its Tsarist regime doing everything it can to suppress socialist tendencies even in European countries. That's why, for example, Marx and Engels supported the Polish uprising of 1863, which sought to restore national independence against the invading reactionary Russian forces. Marx viewed Russia as a malevolent reactionary power which constituted the biggest threat to Europe's democratic and socialist movements. Already in the 18th century, Russia invaded Poland, divided it with Austria and Prussia, and occupied it since. So, since Russian-occupied Poland stood between Russia proper and Western Europe, Poland's revolutionary movement represents a deep contradiction within the Russian Empire, one that had hampered its effort to intervene against the European revolutionaries of the 1830s, and to an extent those in 1848 as well. So Tsar Nicholas I saw himself as the guardian of monarchical order and the Holy Alliance. He was determined to stop revolutionary movements wherever they appeared. In 1849, when the Hungarian Revolution against Habsburg rule threatened to succeed, Austria appealed to Russia for help. And so in June 1849, about 200,000 Russian troops invaded Hungary. And by August, they crushed the revolution and handed control back to the Austrian Empire. And so with this, the Polish independence movement, which hoped 1848 might bring freedom, found itself doubly trapped. So in the Russian partition of Poland, Nicholas I brutally repressed any stirrings of unrest. In the Austrian and Prussian partitions, Russia's military support to those empires meant no Polish uprising could survive. So back in 1848, Marx, in the second section of the manifesto, the one that ends with the famous workers of the word unite, he didn't mention Russia. it's as if he was saying to the proletariat, you don't have any allies in Russia. He says the same thing about the US. So in the 1882 preface, he also includes the US along Russia, but he points here, the point here is this new emphasis on Russia's relevance in the socialist revolution. Now in 1882, when he sees that industrialization is starting in Russia, when he sees the rapidly flowering capitalist swindle and bourgeois property just beginning to develop, he is concerned about the fate of the land owned in common by the peasants. If they get dismantled, like they always do when bourgeois property and capitalism grows, there we might lose an enormous opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity, to trigger the revolution. So right before the passage quoted by Saito, Marx asks, can the Russian Obshchina, I think that's how it is pronounced, but it's the term for the peasant commune. So can the Obshchina, I'm going to say Obshchina, so sorry if I'm butchering it, can the Russian Obshchina, though greatly undermined, yet a form of medieval, primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common property or common ownership? Or on the contrary, must it first pass through the same process of dissolution such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? See, will the commune, the mere, become a higher form of communist common ownership, clearly he's talking about the commons, or end up in the same historical process like in the rest of Europe? So there you have it. He is explicitly including praise for communal land ownership as exemplified by the mere. He adds this insight because he doesn't want his theory to be again misunderstood and to be taken as yet another celebration of history as progress. Clearly he saw the limits of such view of history and needed to include this preface to set the record straight. So no, you don't have to dissolve the commune. It's true that they are undermined and there is work to be done. Science and technology must be involved. We must revolutionize still the agricultural practices of the commune, but this no longer needs to go through capitalism or bourgeois property. We don't need to lose communal property to private property in order to get back communal property with a more rational and progressive form of collective management. Remember, this was the crux of progressive view of history, that the loss of communal property to private property was necessary for the resurrection of communal property in its higher communist form. This is what Marx abandoned at the end of his life. This preface clearly asserts that not only do Russian communes not have to pass through a capitalist stage in development, but that the country may actually be ahead of Western Europe even if a complementary revolution in the West is still necessary, and that the transition to communism can be effected there first. It's undeniable, looking at this, that Marx's view of history has undergone a fundamental transformation. So this, of course, applies to all kinds of nations, not just Russia, but also India, so in Asia, Latin America, Africa, etc. All regions that preserved their archaic communal life and avoided violent destruction by capitalism, the meres, but also the village communes of India. Everywhere the expansion of commune is possible, there is still a revolutionary potential. And as such, history isn't just unilinear. It doesn't follow just one course, but it is multilinear. Saito mentions the American scholar Kevin Anderson, who asserts in his 2016 book Marx at the Margins on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies, that the late Marx created a multilinear and non-reductionist theory of history. So non-reductionist in the sense that you cannot overlook the complexities and differences of non-Western societies. You cannot reduce their particular histories into one abstract theory applicable to all. So in Anderson's words, As Marx engaged more with pre-capitalist nations, he came to incorporate elements of race, ethnicity, and nationalism. There's also a little bit of gender in there when he studied the Iroquois, as well as Roman societies in his notebooks. Engels went into gender in more details after Marx's death when he worked on his Origins of the State, Family, and Private Property, using excerpts from Marx's notebooks, by the way. So about race, Marx said something similar to his analysis of Ireland about the US during the Civil War. Although the North was a capitalist society, Marx threw himself into the anti-slavery cause, critically supporting the Lincoln government against the Confederacy. In his Civil War writing, he connected race to class and argued that white racism had held back labor as a whole. So like colonialism holds back Irish or Indian labor, racism too holds black labor. So it is important, like he argued, for the English working man to stop his irrational racist crusade against the Irish working man, so too the white man must stop being racist if he wants to unleash the productive forces of all. And as such, the First International warned precisely that America's failure to grant full political and social rights to the emancipated slaves would once again drown the country in blood and halt its development. Writing in Das Kapital in Volume 1, so Section 7 of The Working Day, that labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself when it is branded in a black skin. In addition, he concluded that the end of slavery had opened up important new possibilities for American labor. As for Marx, including these elements in his analysis, he refused to bind himself into a single model of development or revolution. Now he recognizes that each nation has its own history, its own trajectory, that progress isn't unilinear but multilinear. The European path, for example, the ancient Greco-Roman feudal and capitalist phases, they do not apply to non-Western societies, and this doesn't mean that those societies aren't progressing or are stagnantly backward. In this sense, the future of non-Western societies was open and not determined by that of the Western Europe. The village commune in India, for example, isn't doomed to be a form of oriental despotism in need of the intervention of capitalism to evolve. So Marx began to abandon his hardcore historical determinism and saw the village commune as a potential for both a democratic communist or a despotic management. Both became a possibility. And he's not talking about a communist that is communism that is crude. Like crude communism is a socialism based on a low level of economic and cultural development, a notion that he had critiqued a lot as early as 1844 in his manuscripts of 1844 in the section Private Property and Communism. Saito mentions the concept of crude communism and the year 1844, but he doesn't give any sources. So if you are looking for where to find this notion of crude communism, it's in the manuscripts of 1844. Marx describes crude communism or rohe communismus as the immature, unreflective form of communism that doesn't really abolish private property, but simply generates it. This is when, for example, people think of communism as leveling down, as maintaining everyone equally in a state of poverty, so you don't really get true liberation. You simply make all possessions common, but by erasing distinctions like talent or individuality. So this communism keeps the logic of private property. The community simply exploits the individual like the capitalist was exploiting it. And as such, the community itself becomes the universal owner. The community as the universal capitalist, as Marx says. So Marx has a way to explain this through marriage and prostitution. Like under private property, marriage is a form of exclusive possession. A woman is the private property of her husband, And so this is analogous to the way a capitalist exclusively owns their property. And prostitution, in Marx's view, is an extension of the logic of alienation. A person's body or capacity is turned into a commodity available for exchange or use. He even calls wage labor a form of general prostitution, since the worker sells their labor power much just like the prostitute sells sexual services. So in its crudest form, communism proposes abolishing marriage by making women collective property shared equally by all men. And Marx calls this a brutish and thoughtless idea because it treats women as objects of consumption, just like under private property, only now the owner is the collective community instead of the individual husband. So here, life is reduced to direct physical possession and equality of wages, with everyone, treated as a worker and nothing else. And it has also an emphasis on envy. Crude communism, according to Marx, is driven by generalized envy. In capitalist society, each person's private property exists in competition with others. The poor often envy the richer. Even the rich compete with each other, which create this urge to reduce things to a common level as to sabotage the other's chances to have more than me. This is already part of competition in capitalism. So crude communism takes that competitive envy and turns it into a political principle. If some have more, bring them down to the minimum everyone else has. So here, equality simply means leveling down, not raising everyone up. Marx calls this general envy constituting itself as a power, basically envy institutionalized. If communism is based on envy, it doesn't abolish private property in the deeper sense, it just spreads the same mentality to everyone. And so instead of transforming the way humans relate to each other and to things, overcoming alienation, crude communism simply negates wealth and culture because they are seen as privileges, not because they are alienated form of human capacity. So the result is that instead of a rich, varied human life, you get uniform poverty, the simplicity of the poor and crude man who has a few things, who has a few needs. That's why Marx says crude communism has a definite and limited standard. It aims for a minimum, not for human flourishing. And so this isn't what Saito is arguing for, of course. Recognizing the revolutionary potential of the commune and abandoning productivism doesn't mean that we have to live accordingly to only our most basic and physical needs, without culture or without wealth. And in parenthesis, Marx developed another concept in the 1870s about a form of communism that resembles this one, or is related to crude communism, which is barracks communism. Kasernen communismus. And so this is a term that you can find in Marx and Engels' 1873 investigation, The Alliance of Socialist Democracy and the International Working Men's Association. Long story short, Marxists and anarchists, they don't get along, and in the First International, you had the clash between Bakunin, the leader of the anarchists, and Marx, which ended with the expulsion of Bakunin and his faction, the Alliance of Socialist Democracy, from the International. One of the reasons of such expulsion is that Marx and Engels said that the kind of communism suggested by the anarchists is this barracks communism. And they used an article to support this, published in 1870 by a Russian anarcho-communist who let's say was kind of a psychopath. So this guy is named Sergei Nechayev, or Nechayev, because it's written with a CH. So anyway, I'm gonna say Nechayev. The problem was that Bakunin endorsed Nechayev's ideas. even though he distanced himself from him because the dude, again, was a manipulator and a psychopath, ready to blackmail his own comrades. So anyways, in the article, so the article is called The Fundamentals of the Future Social System. So that article says what communism would look like. And Marx and Engels summarize it by comparing it to barracks. It's an authoritarian, regimented, military-style communism that controls every aspect of life, like soldiers in barracks. So the term kazanen means barracks, where soldiers live under strict discipline, surveillance, and uniformity. So Marx opposed any communism that organizes people like soldiers in a camp, with their work, living arrangements, and consumption entirely controlled from above. The community becomes here an authoritarian manager, deciding where you live, what you do, what you get, when and where, or with who to eat, etc. And so this resembles crude communism because of the low standards of living it keeps people in. You can argue that this can resemble, to some extent, Soviet-style communism, although people's standards of living weren't lower than people's standards of living in the US or Europe, and at periods they even got better. But it's the same in regards of a centralized bureaucracy controlling everything. Nikayev explicitly wrote in his article that communism can be accomplished only by concentrating all the means of social existence in the hands of his committee, and the proclamation of compulsory physical labor for everyone. And so ironically, Bakunin and Nikayev claimed that they were anti-authoritarians, and Marx and Engels, they were like, really nigga? And they wrote sarcastically in their 8th chapter of the investigation. So this is, kind of sarcastic. So they wrote, what a beautiful model of barrack room communism. Here you have it all: communal eating, communal sleeping, assessors and offices regulating education, production, consumption, in a word, all social activity, and to crown all, our committee, anonymous and unknown to anyone, as the superior director. This is indeed the purest anti-authoritarianism. So yeah, so they're making fun of, they're being ironic and sarcastic, making fun of Nikayev's form of communism. So anyways, crude communism, besides its limited means, would be confined to just one place, where Marx is an international. The national support that he gives for India, Poland, Ireland, etc. isn't nationalism for its own sake. It's because it's also the best way to create communication, solidarity, and technological and scientific progress between the nations. It's not a call for each nation to do its thing indifferently to the rest of the world, in complete isolation. There would be no intellectual or economic flourishing like that as well. True freedom for Marx is always in a global context. So radical transformation of the on the basis of Russia's rural communes would be possible only if accompanied by parallel revolutionary transformations on the part of the working class movements of Western Europe. Everyone should get on board with this. So it is not just that Marx and Engels, in their preface, they averred that such a Russian revolution started from the rural communes could have a communist basis. They instead insist that for a communist development to be real, to be a real possibility in non-capitalist Russia, a Russian revolution must link up with its counterpart based in the Western labor movement. In short, we don't turn the communes into communism just to tell the world don't bother us, but as a global, part of a global international revolution. Both the peasants and the workers of the world must unite, because turns out they are both, and perhaps the peasants still collectively managing the communes a little bit more, they are both revolutionary and have great resistance potential against colonialism. So during the years 1879 and 82, Marx embarked upon a series of excerpt notes on current scholarship on a multifaceted group of non-Western and non-European societies, among them contemporary India, Indonesia, Russia, Algeria, and Latin America. He also made notes on studies of indigenous peoples, such as Native Americans and Australian Aborigines. And one core theme of these excerpt notebooks was the communal social relations and property forms found in so many of these societies. In his studies of India, Algeria, and Latin America, Marx discussed and he discerned the persistence of communal forms in the face of attempts by Western colonization to destroy them in favor of private property. And in some cases, like Algeria, these communal forms, these commons, were directly tied to anti-colonial resistance. And so let's conclude this episode with a quote from Saito. "The road to socialism is thus unbound from the developmental model of Western Europe. Rather, Marx concludes that the search for methods for transitioning to a communist society must include the thorough study of the complexities and differences in the histories and social systems of non-Western societies. Marx's Eurocentric view of history as progress thus ends up replaced by one that focuses on non-Western societies, actively praising the communal forms found in them. And if this is true, then Said's criticism of Marx as an Orientalist is no longer sustainable." Okay, so we stop here for today. We still have the last part of the chapter. To go through, and so next week we're gonna start with this new phase of Marx's communism. This is when we're gonna start to talk about degrowth communism, and so I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was enjoyable. Please subscribe, leave the comment, like the video, share it if you want. And as always, thank you.